Laudetur Jesus Christus, praised be Jesus Christ. Welcome to Veritatis Vox, a channel devoted to being a voice for the voice of truth, who is our Lord Jesus Christ. My name is Matt Gaspers, and I'm very happy to be joined today again by my friend Ryan Grant of Mediatrix Press. Good morning, Ryan. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you're doing well.
Good morning. Yeah, not too bad.
All right. And we are going to discuss, because this is kind of a continuation of our previous discussion back on May 27th, which I named Quo Vadis Leo, Where Are You Going, Leo? The famous story from, I guess it's a little bit apocryphal, but St. Peter, I think towards the end of his life, is planning to leave the city of Rome, I think for his own safety. Is that kind of the gist of it? And
Hmm.
he sees a vision of our Lord, or he sees our Lord, going back to Rome, and Peter asks him, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus says, I'm going to be crucified again. Basically, our Lord's way of saying you need to get back to work and get back to doing what you're supposed to be doing and stay in Rome with the people and shepherd the flock, that kind of thing. So, um, yeah, we're going to discuss this new Crux interview of Pope Leo, his first major interview. And as I posted the day that I found out about it, that it had been granted to Crux, I knew right away that it was not going to be good, because the man who founded Crux, or I believe he founded it, or if not, he's the one in charge of it, the editor, John Allen, worked for many years, I think close to 20 years, for the National Catholic Reporter, or as John Venari used to call it appropriately, the National Catholic Distorter,
Right.
which is just basically just a heretical rag. So I knew right away it was not a good sign that Pope Leo had chosen to give his first major interview to Crux, because they're also known as being, progressive, liberal, heterodox, whatever. Certainly not a bastion of orthodoxy at the very least. But I think today we're going to begin our discussion just by reminding folks that, and I think this is probably true for Ryan as well, I wasn't surprised that what that Pope Leo said several concerning things during this interview based on his previous statements. Like, this shouldn't really be a surprise for any of us based on what Pope Leo, some of the things he has already said. And, Ryan and I have been trying to be somewhat cautiously optimistic, but as we said in our last show, the subtitle of which was a sober assessment, we also need to be realistic about who Pope Leo is, who, Robert Prevost is, and not have, you know, unrealistic, irrational hopes about his pontificate. God can do all things, of course. All things are possible with God by his grace, but really not surprised to be seeing what we're seeing with this new interview. So I wanted to remind folks of a couple of key quotes from early, the first days of Leo's pontificate that were major red flags for me. I think they were probably the same for Ryan. So this is the one that I've really um, focused on a lot on my channel and various podcasts, because I think it's crucial to understanding his pontificate. He said this literally on day 3 of his pontificate, his first address to the College of Cardinals, as you can see in the photo. And he said, I would like us to renew together today our complete commitment to the path that the Universal Church has now followed for decades in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. The path that has basically meant, led to the crisis in the church, in other words. And he said, Pope Francis masterfully and concretely set it forth in the apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium. And for a thorough critique of that statement and the reasons why it's so concerning, I direct you to our previous discussion on May 27th, which is available on my channel, and it's called Quo Vadis Leo, a Sober Assessment. So, and then this other 9 days later, Pope Leo was speaking to an ecumenical interreligious group at the Vatican, and this is what he said. One of the strong emphases of Pope Francis's pontificate was that of universal fraternity. In this regard, the Holy Spirit really urged him to advance with great strides the initiatives already undertaken by previous pontiffs, especially since St. John the 23rd, who obviously was the Pope who opened the Second Vatican Council. And he went on to say on that occasion, the Pope of Fratelli Tutti promoted both the ecumenical path and interreligious dialogue. He did so above all by cultivating interpersonal relationships in such a way that without taking anything away from ecclesial bonds, the human trait of the encounter was always valued. I mean, that sounds exactly like something Francis would say, this kind of buzz language. And he ends this passage by saying, "May God help us to treasure his witness." I'm sorry, I can't I can't treasure the witness of Francis.
Witness. What? I think is the good question to
Yes.
the truth of the faith, to the necessity of the Catholic faith for the salvation of all men, to repentance from sins, that the wicked members of the Catholic Church might become good and holy and start bearing fruit and not be like the withered fig tree. Yeah, that witness, right? Oh, fraternalism, Abrahamic houses, kind of more of the same. Again, the world mocks and rejects the church for, because, oh, look, they're trying to be cool like us. I compare it just like with things like evolution, or it's like they already, at least in terms of those who aren't per se, but say, well, we have to believe this, otherwise we're going to look ridiculous. And I'm like, well, that's just brown nosing. That's just ecclesiastical brown nosing. You're just trying to brown nose with the world, and they still hate you and think you're some barbaric dark age relic because you don't let women in the priesthood, and you don't, and you say contraception's evil. People don't realize when you go into like a strong conservative Catholic that has their peers are strong conservative Catholics, right, in the mainstream of the church. That they know there's Catholics who reject birth control, but the idea that it seems like a normative idea because they accept the teaching of the church, it accords the natural sense. You go to average secular people, whether they're Protestant, whether they're not, especially as scientists, any gathering of average people, and you say that contraception is evil, the hate, just the view that you are some dim-witted person. No, this is the 21st century, darn it. We don't live in these dark age things anymore. They already hate you. They're not going to start liking you because you start talking about everyone getting together and be nice. And they're not going to be any more open to the gospel, honestly, because we decide to put all of our efforts into sitting around and talking. Ecclesia loquens, as Michael Davies coined it.
This is a good comment from Jose Marti in the live chat. He says, "Good morning, guys. Pope Leo is looking more like a nicer, less chaotic Pope Francis. I agree. Pray for him. I have my hopes, but I'll take him at his word." And that's a great segue into something I wanted to mention. So Pope-splaining is the last thing that we need to start doing with Pope Leo. We really need to stop. And I think a prime example of Pope-splaining that I came across the other day is, and I like and respect Dr. Gavin Ashenden, who was formerly with Catholic Unscripted, but I mean, he has on his Substack basically like the Catholic version of QAnon, that the Pope is speaking in code in this interview, and it's just, no, I can't go along with this. This is ridiculous. Any thoughts, Ryan?
I haven't read the article, and so, but the suggestion of it, we'll put it that way, it just sounds like I think, just like you said, Catholic QAnon, which had actually a lot of Catholics in that. It's more hopium.
Right.
There's no basis for, or it's like what's that fellow in Italy, Cianci, with his Benedict code, and we're going to find the secret code. And even Benedict's letter, where he said clearly he's renounced the whole thing, he's not Pope anymore. Oh, even here there's secret codes for us. Whenever I see the secret code, I see, let me lay a tapestry in which what I want to be true is true, and then other people read it out. It's hopium.
Yep, exactly right. So yeah, I guess we can't be accused of being part of the so-called Trad Inc. because we're speaking out against Pope Leo. We might get into that a little more later, but we're not card-carrying members of Trad Inc. people, just so you know.
If we're in Trad Inc., our checks are in arrears. Haven't seen one yet.
All right, so we're going to get into the interview. I mean, it's a pretty sprawling interview. It was carried out over a couple of days, over a few hours back in July, I believe, if I remember correctly. So there was a delay between the interview itself, which was conducted, I think, at Castel Gandolfo in like mid-July, something like that, maybe end of July. And then excerpts started being released in mid September, I think like early last week. Yeah, I think starting on Sunday, the September 14th, so a little over a week ago. And they've been published, in installments since then. So I picked out some, what I consider to be key quotes from the interview. We're not obviously don't have time to cover it in full because it's just too long, but we're going to hit some of the highlights and different topics. The first of which I think is probably the most concerning, in my opinion, is Pope Leo clearly implies in his statements that doctrine, like matters that are of divine and natural law, can change over time, and that he, as the Pope, has the power to do that. So this is what I highlighted in my when I posted about our live stream a couple days ago. So when asked about, quote, the role of women in the church and the church's approach to the LGBTQ plus community, that was how the interviewer Elise Ann Allen phrased it. Pope Leo said, quote, I at the moment don't have an intention of changing the teaching of the church on the topic, referring to the ordination of women. I mean, that right there in and of itself should be enough to be like, whoa. Well, we're dealing with a modernist here. That can't ever change, Your Holiness.
Mhm.
Women are not valid matter for the Sacrament of Holy Orders, whether it's of whatever grade. Never have been, never will be, and you have no ability to change that. So why would you say at the moment I don't have an intention of changing the teaching? You can't
Right.
change it.
It could, just to give the, because I read that and I just like, all right, before I go on a long rant on that, let me get into his head a bit and try to figure out. So, is this something that he could mean something properly orthodox, but have said it in a sense that's male sonans, or it verges on heresy? Honestly, it's one of those things that, like, is he just speaking off the cuff in some colloquial manner, and he's maybe not even stopping because he's just given this interview and he's probably prepared a couple of things, but said, yeah, that's not something I'm inclined to. Does he mean by that, I'm not inclined to wade into this at all, and he just said it in a way that looks entirely modernist? Or does he actually mean it in the sense? And so there's part of me that wants to say, all right, he might have meant this way. But irrespective of that, the plain sense of what he said, just in plain words, suggests that he understands that he has the power to do this, but he doesn't think it's opportune. That's area. I mean, he doesn't, but he thinks he does. That's what the plain words would suggest. And so I would like it to be the case that he misspoke, but we've had so much of that over the last, frankly, since 1965, if you will, or more. Oh, he just misspoke. He didn't mean to say it that way. Well, the original Italian. In this case, I'm pretty sure the original for this interview is English.
It is,
So,
yeah. And the
yeah.
other thing I wanted to point out in that regard is this interview was conducted for publication in a book. And he had to approve all of this for publication, and he didn't change his
Mhm.
words. So
Right.
this was
And
not
that's
just
why I'm
this
asking
wasn't just
things.
some off the cuff thing on an airplane. This is for, the ages in publication in print.
Precisely. And that's part of the problem. And so it's that, and I guess also, if we're going to jump into his head a little bit in terms of the milieu that the ecclesiastical milieu that he has run in for quite some time and been a part of, it's that, well, John Paul II, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, he did not actually say you could never have female deacons. He only talked about the priesthood. And so therefore, as that line of thinking goes, that's still open to talk about. Whereas in reality, when there's two things with that too. One, I'm sure he is aware that Cardinal Ratzinger, as prefect of the CDF, with John Paul II's approval, declared that this teaching requires an assent of the mind, more than just the assent of the mind and will, as it is de fide. This is of the faith. Clearly, it might have been given an encyclical. It might not be exactly a solemn judgment, but this is of the faith by virtue of the tradition. So that can't be changed. Now, the second question, well, does this cover the diaconate? Because now, once you understand properly the theology of sacred order as it's given, by the church, by the theologians, Roman Catechism, wherever you're going to cite, the diaconate is part of holy orders in such a way it can't be separated. It's not a minor order which is instituted by the church for a certain reason, where at least in theory, I don't even know if that works, honestly, but because you would have been considered a cleric back in those days, and that's again reserved to women alone. But the divine constitution of, say, the
men
office
alone,
of
you mean?
Protector, by itself, I don't think per se, but certainly by the tradition, nobody wants that. I would not say it's a good thing or it's something you should do. So, and of course, there was obviously the understanding in Ministerium Quaedam of Paul VI that we have to get rid of these minor orders and replace them with these new things that are not properly orders. That way, women can be a part of them. That was the thinking that went into that. So, obviously, even they understood that there's something about the minor orders you couldn't, put someone. So, anyways, that's not even relevant. We're talking about the diaconate, which is a part of major orders. And there is no instance in the history of the church of women being ordained to be deacons. And every study group, no matter how much they want to change that, even under Francis, the study groups came back saying there's no evidence of women being ordained to function as deacons in the history of the church, that their role was basically like the Roman custom of giving the female version for that name for somebody who assisted in that similar type of role. You already see that because especially the feminists love to pick up on this. Pope St. Martin I's mother is depicted in a mosaic, and it says Episcopa. And they say, oh, look, see, there are women bishops. But it's total ignorance of the way Latin and Roman culture works, is that it shows she's a part of the household of Bishop Pope Martin, because, and so therefore she has that name Episcopa to her, not because she is a bishop or was ordained or functions, but because she's part of the household. In the same way that you're a slave, but you get the name, being part of that, that household once you're freed. And even though you're not born to that name, or anyone who's adopted, in the gens Julia, for example, you get the name Julius, irrespective of whether you're born from that lineage, but you're brought into it, right? And so that applies to all sorts of different things in just common Latin usage between, say, the first century BC and maybe the 6th century, even in Greek. So that's where you'll see that. That's why that name deacon is given to women. Thank you. That name deacon is given to women because they perform a role that assists the bishop. And a lot of times they might even be the wives of actual deacons, although usually the diaconate, when it was permanent, was actually celibate. But in the beginning, because you're taking converts in and you're ordaining men who you find worthy, you had certain married men for a time until the church put in the canons. And once the church was established, that now we need to make this normative and orderly, no more married men in these roles. So that's what, and again and again. So there's no actual evidence women were, ordained as deacons and carried out that function as deacons. So, and I'm sure that Pope Leo can look at his own commissions that tell him that very thing. He doesn't need to see some guy on the internet smoking his pipe, telling everyone the way it is. It's like, no, he has his own commissions from his own people that say exactly that. And I'm sure that's on his mind, but, so he actually can't change it, irrespective of how much he might want to. So, but the curious thing, and I think what really reveals that this isn't just some off the cuff saying and that he means it to be in an Orthodox sense, but said it kind of offhand, is the other statement where he says, well, attitudes have to change first. And then, we can have I want attitude. I think we have to change attitudes before we even think about changing what the church says about any given question. I find it highly unlikely, certainly in the near future, that the church's doctrine in terms of what the church teaches about sexuality, what the church teaches about marriage, will change. Now, that obviously foresees, but if those conditions would change, then the church's teaching could change. That seems to be what he means to say. And all I can say is that is simply not Catholic teaching. And so I've given this quote before. If you could put it up, I just shared a tab.
Sure. Hang on just a second. So put that one on, and here we go.
There we go. So this is the Vatican I's Constitution Dei Filius, right? A formal teaching of the Vatican Council. And let me just go. Here we go. So hinc sacrarum quoque dogmaticum is sensus perpetuo est retenendus quem semel declaravit sancta mater ecclesia, nec umquam ab eo sensu altior intelligentiae specie et nomine recidendum. Okay, so what they're getting at here is that all of the sacred dogmas, hence each of the sacred dogmas must be retained, retenendus est, must be retained perpetually, forever. Yeah, right. The sense of the sacred dogmas, that is not just what they teach, but the various things that drafted them and show what is being embraced by them and rejected on the other hand. So they must be retained perpetually, which the Mother Church once declared, semel declaravit. The senses of these doctrines, what they taught, must be, that they, at the time of their declaration, that's what that means, once declared, and never, necum quam ab eo sensu, and never from that sense, for the, we must never go away, recidendum. There should never be a recession from that sense in the name of a new and better understanding, is essentially what that is. And so under the species in terminology of some kind of other understanding. So basically, to pack that out, I don't know what the English in the Vatican website has, but to render it more fluently, that the dogmas, the sense of the sacred dogmas must be perpetually retained, which the Holy Mother of the Church has once declared and never departed from, for the sake of a new understanding.
Right.
What I ask is the changing of attitudes, but a new understanding. And this is, and of course, he says we're going to continue on the legacy of Pope Francis. We're going to do exactly what Pope Francis did. What is the thing that Pope Francis said with the death penalty? He almost said precisely what Vatican I condemns. That we have a new understanding of human dignity that we didn't have before. Therefore, we must depart from the sense in which the Church has once declared the teaching of the death penalty.
Excellent point. And what's also striking to me is that he's not even Leo isn't even trying to hide this underneath what Francis often did. He would appeal, he appealed multiple times to St. Vincent of Lerins and his teaching, a church father, his teaching on the legitimate development of doctrine and what it actually means. Francis would take him out of context and quote him very selectively and not give the full sense. But the quote that you just provided from Vatican I actually quotes St. Vincent of Lerins to this effect. It says, "Therefore, let there be growth and abundant progress in understanding, knowledge, and wisdom in each and all, in individuals and in the whole church, at all times and in the progress of ages, but only within the proper limits, that is, within the same dogma, the same meaning, the same judgment." And St. Pius X, a few decades after
In the
Vatican I.
Latin of Vince Loreni actually says eodem sensu, in the
Yes.
same sense. That
Yes.
same word that Vatican I is using.
Yes. And then a few decades later, in his Oath Against Modernism, St. Pius X says, "I sincerely accept that the doctrine of the faith," so we're not only talking about extraordinarily defined dogmas, we're talking about the doctrine of the faith as a whole, the deposit of faith, whether it's defined in an extraordinary manner, extraordinary magisterium by a pope or a council, or just the ordinary and universal magisterium of the church. Those are the two forms that Vatican I specifies. So in his Oath Against Modernism, St. Pius X says, "I sincerely accept that the doctrine of the faith was handed down to us in the same sense and always with the same meaning," using the language of Vatican I, "from the apostles through the Orthodox fathers. I therefore entirely reject the heretical theory of an evolution of the dogmas, that they can change from one meaning to another different from the one that the church previously held. That's a very important. So, I mean, based on this language of Pope Leo, would he be able to say with honesty that that clause of the oath against modernism? It seems no. I mean, I don't know how else to say it.
Yeah. Without,
And that's not the only, so he says also in the interview, that's where I see things right now. I am certainly willing to continue to listen to people in reference to these two issues of female ordination and all the LGBT rainbow stuff. There are these study groups which were established during the Synod on Synodality, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, which has responsibility for some of those questions. They continue to examine the theological background, history of some of those questions, and we'll walk with that and see what comes. So clearly he doesn't understand that these things that he's talking about are immutable, they're unchangeable, and he has no authority to do anything to them. They are de fide, as you said earlier. So that's kind of the first major red flag with this interview. He also gets into some comments he was asked about the traditional Latin Mass, liturgical matters, which I wanted to get into next. So he says, there is another issue, which is also another hot button issue, which I have already received a number of requests and letters about. The question about people always say, quote, the Latin Mass. Well, you can say Mass in Latin right now. If it's the Vatican II rite, there's no problem. And we know that's your favorite, right, Ryan? The Novus Ordo in Latin.
oh, man. How much time you got?
And he goes on, obviously, between the Tridentine Mass and the Vatican II Mass, the Mass of Paul VI, I'm not sure where that's going to go. It's obviously very complicated. But in reality, it's actually not all that complicated. Like, it's actually quite simple. The traditional Roman rite, the received and approved rite of the Roman Church, and to use the language of the Council of Trent, is the so-called Tridentine Mass, which is simply the Mass of the ages, codified. It was codified or canonized basically by the Council of Trent, but it's not like the Trent didn't just make up this missile out of thin air from nothing.
Right.
It was the received and approved rite of the Roman Church, just like in the Eastern rites, they have their received and approved rites as well. We have, with the Missal of Paul VI, we have something entirely different. We don't have time to go into all the details of that, but so he goes on to say about the traditional Mass, I do know that part of that issue, unfortunately, has become, again, part of a process of polarization. And then he basically is taking the same line as Francis. People have used the liturgy as an excuse for advancing other topics. I don't know what he means by that exactly. He says it's become a political tool, and that's unfortunate. Again, what do you mean, Holy Father, that it's become a political tool? It's the tool by which we hand on the faith in all of its integrity. It's like the prime expression and manifestation of the Catholic faith, the traditional Latin Mass. So I'm not sure what you mean when you say it's advancing other topics or it's a political tool. He says, I think sometimes they say abuse of the liturgy from what we call the Vatican II Mass was not helpful for people. I mean, talk about an understatement. Yeah, it was not. No, it was horrible, detrimental, like, to the loss of souls, basically driving people out of the church and such. What else? He goes on to say, again, we've become polarized so that instead of being able to say, well, if we celebrate the Vatican II liturgy in a proper way, do you really find that much difference between this experience and that experience? And to me, that really reveals where he's at with his understanding or lack thereof of the traditional Mass. Basically, he thinks, if you're offering a reverent Novus Ordo, there's no substantial difference between the two.
Right. And oh boy, is there ever. Well, first observation, I guess, going backwards and up. he mentioned another part of the Crux interview that he hasn't yet had a chance to sit down with those who advocate in favor of the traditional mass.
Right.
Yeah, I have not had the chance to really sit down with a group of people who are advocating for the Tridentine rite. There's an opportunity coming up soon. There will be occasions for that. But that is an issue that I think also maybe with synodality, we have to sit down and talk about it. So, there's so many things to unpack. So I guess, starting with that, I don't think he understands at all why, he looks at it, well, our mass is just fine, so why aren't you going to it? And why do these people agitate for this? And it's just a problem. And it's one of those things where, well, it wouldn't be a problem if bishops and the Vatican had allowed entirely free access to it, but they can't. And it's actually Massimo Fagioli and people like that have expressed precisely why they cannot do that, because the traditional mass expresses a different ecclesiology. That's what they've said.
Which Francis has expressly said, and Cardinal Supich, Cardinal Roach.
Yep. Yeah, we could talk about Supich's little dumpster fire of nonsense, but it's so ridiculous. Because the church erred for 1,500 years in giving you liturgy, but now you can trust the church in giving you a proper liturgy. I just don't buy it. I've got to take a call real quick. Can you carry this on for a minute? I'll be right back.
Sure, will do. So let's go back to the to his quote here. He says, as Ryan read, there's an opportunity coming up soon, and I'm sure there will be occasions for that. So I don't know if Pope Leo is referring to his meeting with Cardinal Burke, which took place on, August 22nd, I believe, as reported by the Holy See Press Office, the Catholic Herald, and others. But I don't, to my knowledge, and I haven't looked into it, I don't know if Cardinal Burke has publicly confirmed that he spoke with Pope Leo about the traditional Latin Mass issue. I mean, I imagine he probably did. I don't know if we have public confirmation of that. If somebody knows and wants to send a link or a comment in the live chat, please do. And then also, I think just today, my friend Diane Montagna and others, other journalists have posted that Pope Leo received in audience today His Eminence Cardinal Robert Serra. And obviously we know Cardinal Serra is also a big proponent of the traditional Latin Mass. So maybe His Eminence was going to bring that up with Pope Leo as well. I don't know what he's referring to. And again, remember, this interview was conducted in July. So he could have been referring to the meeting with Cardinal Burke, maybe to today's meeting with Cardinal Serra. We just don't know. But ultimately, I mean, what he thinks this needs to be dealt with in a so-called synodal manner, where we just kind of sit down at a round table and share our thoughts and ideas, and in a very respectful, inclusive manner, and make sure we don't offend anybody. And
right.
But I think the revealing statement in this paragraph is, so what does he say? It's become the kind of issue that's so polarized that people aren't willing to listen to one another, as if we need, as if trads need to be open to listening to the virtues and wonderful things about the Novus Ordo, and
listening is a one-way street, because in the end, again, for the very reasons that Pope Francis laid out, that others have laid out, it is simply not going to be that, okay, we're just going to go back to what Benedict, and he widened what Benedict said and make it so everybody can say this Mass, because they saw what happened. More and more people were saying it. Friend of mine, I won't want to give too much revealing detail on him, the diocesan priest, and knew him, a long time ago. And so we used to argue when I was a young trad, and I was one of those insufferable young trads that the joy of finding this, and now is to tell everyone how great it is, whether you want to hear it or not. And so we were arguing about, the offertory and other things like that. And at a certain point, we just said, all right, we're just going to have to agree to disagree. And I said, that's fine. And, it was getting a bit acrimonious. And so I left it. I never brought it up with him again. Congratulated him on his ordination, everything like that. And then one day, out of the blue, after COVID, he texts and he says, remember we used to argue about that? You were right. And I was like, well, I was not expecting that. I was not going to do the I told you so lap or anything like that. I was just like, wow, that's great. Praise God. What brought you to that? And so he had more opportunities to say it. and he got conformed by it. It became his standard of judgment looking at the Novus. And the more he looked at it, he's like, yeah, there are problems with this.
Yeah, here's
So that's
a
why.
great comment. Great comment to that effect in the live chat. Polarization, advanced different topics, political, all can be applied to the Novus Ordo as well. Absolutely. And
Mhm.
here's the thing,
Yeah.
like as Ryan said earlier, and as Pope Francis emphasized, Cardinal Roach, Cardinal Supich, the reason why these people hate the Latin Mass and don't want it is because they understand that it represents the traditional Catholic faith. And for them, the
Mhm.
Novus Ordo represents something else.
This new thing in
It's
a period of transition before it becomes something else. Even I mean, there's so many things on this subject, but ultimately, yeah, it comes down to what we've already mentioned. There's a different ecclesiology, and then the other thing is, it is all things to all men except trans. No two, instances of the Novus Ordo are the same, really. In the fact that even what Pope Leo says, well, anyone wants to say Latin in the Vatican II rite in Latin, they can do that. I mean, one, it's not even really the Vatican II rite. That's another topic.
right.
But no, that's actually false. How about any of the bishops that you appointed when you were in the congregation of bishops? What will they do when their clergy comes to them and says, "Hey, we want to say," or their clergy come to them and say, "We want to do the Novus Ordo in Latin."
Yeah,
What's
try
their
telling
bishop?
that to the bishop in what is it, Charlotte, Bishop Michael
Yeah,
Martin. He's
Bishop
not going to
Martin.
allow that.
Tell it to Bishop Martin. He's not going to let that happen. Or try that again, in Detroit. Bishop Weisenberger's not going to allow that. Try that in Costa Rica. What happened? There was a priest in Costa Rica who was actually, former vicar of the diocese, kind of high up. He was saying the traditional mass for Catholics in Costa Rica. Jailers of the tradition came down, and he said, "All right, I'm going to obey it." And so, but he still wanted to provide for that community. He said, "Hey, we'll just switch to doing the Novus Ordo in Latin." That very week, as soon as the bishop found out, he suspended the priest ad divinis, and then recommended psychological counseling. Basically, demanded that in order to go back to ministry, he has to go to psychological counseling, which is
Re-education camp, in other words.
re-education camps. Well, and it's funny about that. That's precisely where you look at so many priests that had a persistent attacks of Catholicism and had to preach actual Catholic doctrine, 80s, 90s, etc., even 2000s. And then the bishop would sit them down and say, "You're going to psychological counseling." And then, once they put the full weight of everything on them, make them feel like they had to do it, they get full power of attorney over them. And then you have everything down at St. Luke's, from being chemically lobotomized to psychologically browbeaten and turned into a very, hollow person from what you used to be, and to be more compliant. And that is precisely what the Soviets did. They weaponized psychology to crush dissent. See, you're mentally ill. That's why you're not doing what everyone else is. And you see this in, like, even modern psychology in the US does this too. You have things like, oppositional defiance disorder. It's a totally made up disorder for somebody who thinks too much, essentially. And that's what you have, with that's essentially, these Soviet tactics are precisely what the mainstream church did to faithful priests in many, many places through the 80s and 90s. I mean, just look on Father Zusseldorf's blog. What does the prayer really say, right? I think it's still up that way. And you just do a search for St. Luke's, and you will get entries. You will get priests that survived it, that testimony to this. You get all the the background data on that type of thing. So that's what they did to a priest who said the Novus Ordo in Latin. Because even as much as I'm going to rip the thing in 10 Ways to Tuesday in about a few minutes, they can't tolerate the vestiges of the old religion either. It was never meant to be said in Latin. They composed it in Latin, and of course the Latin is barbarous, honestly. It uses the New Vulgate, which is a disaster from the history of the Vulgate. I don't want to lay it so much in John Paul II's feet, because it was already done when he became Pope. They just told him, "Oh yeah, here's the fruit of our work," and he rubber stamped it. But it essentially, conforms to the Protestant United Bible Society's Greek edition, vitiates the actual manuscript renderings of the Vulgate, has renderings that are not attested to in any source, grammatical errors, things that actually make no sense in the New Vulgate. And that's what's used in the Latin Novus Ordo. At least they're not doing the readings in Latin, but in the parts that are incorporated into the ordinary or the propers or what have you. And the Psalms are another disaster in Latin wise. But it was never meant to be said in Latin. In fact, they didn't even produce a proper altar missal for it because it was understood this will be translated immediately and then put into in the vernacular languages all around the world. And there was never a thought that, outside of a handful of gatherings here and there, you would do much of it in Latin. So it was never designed for that. Then,
right. I think the modernists at the council probably inserted the phrase in Sacro Sanctum Concilium about having the ordinary of the Mass in Latin as a way of appeasing most of the fathers to ram it through, and they knew what they were going to do afterwards. I mean,
right. And because there is certainly a coordinated attempt after the council that it uses media, that uses all kinds of different sources to get to push what happened. And a lot of times you have priests that hadn't read the conciliar documents, so they don't know, and they're just being told this is what's happening. Any of the bishops who are there, they're being told, well, this is what is happening. There's people in their diocese that are placed. This is what we're going to do. And they'd be like, well, what's the base of that? Well, it's Vatican II. He's like, well, how was that Vatican II? I don't remember that. And say, oh, well, it's in these directives and doctrines, and this is where, and they'd be like, okay. And so then all these things were being pushed in a very coordinated way all around the world. You had films. There's a film with Elvis in it. I cannot remember the title. I should look it up. But and he does the song, and at times they're changing, and they show you Mass in that transitional period between the council and the Novus Ordo, where and it was Change of Habit, 1969. The film comes out.
There you go.
So this is a Hollywood production with Elvis Presley and Mary Tyler Moore, and it comes out in 1969, and it shows like a Mass. The priest is wearing really reverent-looking Gothic vestment, and and they go in, but then Elvis, all the stuff's in English, and Elvis is doing the guitar, and then Mary Tyler Moore plays the nun that leaves the convent to go with him, and so it's there's folk, it's popularizing folk Mass, at folk music at Mass and all these types of things. And so it's like, and people are going to the theater to watch it. It's like a, programming from Hollywood to tell Catholics, it's changing, everything's changing, and it's good. It's Elvis. Come on, what's wrong with Elvis?
That's really interesting. I've never heard.
You want to tell me there's no coordinated effort that this movie just, all the work that goes into a film back when they actually care and crafted good movies, that it comes out. It's kind of crazy that. So Change of Habit. That's the film. It's worth checking out. And at some point, I need to do a deep dive and see what I can find out about how that actually came together. And if my contention that is part of a coordinated effort would actually be borne out by the evidence, I'd be really interested about that.
Yeah. So
but
I think
then,
go ahead.
They're not the same liturgy. So, and he's approaching it. And I guess if you don't have any experience much with the traditional Mass or looked terribly deeply into traditional issues, it's entirely possible. I mean, when I was first Catholic, I didn't really know anything about anything. And I still don't know that much. But honestly, when I got in, I was a kid. I was 16. My mother had a strong conversion through watching Mother Angelica at EWTN, and then she just took us to all right, you're going to Catholic Church now. We do some classes, and then I received my first communion in the Catholic Church, and that was it. I was supposed to be Catholic now. Didn't know anything about it. So liturgy was just what it was. And then I heard about how it used to be in Latin. And I was like, oh, that sounds kind of cool. Actually, I didn't know Latin at the time or anything about it. And I just said, that sounds really awesome. As a young kid with no experience whatsoever about Latin, except boomers telling me how terrible it was, and I thought it was cool. And then when I went to college in Steubenville, I heard that that business, and it was a talking. People would talk about it every once in a while, often negatively. And then there was a Novus Ordo Latin Mass on campus where the scholar would do Gregorian chant. I would get to once in a while, and so that just buttressed this idea that Mass before the council was exactly like Mass as is now, except it was in Latin. And that was my idea until I first saw my first traditional Mass. And that was a completely different experience than seeing the Novus Ordo in Latin. And actually, recently, if you haven't checked it out, the Hand Missile Project on Twitter, he does a lot of really good primary source research and really getting back to it. And he's doing a project now, how the average faithful received all the changes by pulling all the newspaper, excerpts, opinion pieces, writings, anything about people who were actually there writing about it as it was happening. And he had this one fellow in Italy who was quoted that now that it was in English, he was happy he could really participate in a way that he never could before or something. And that is precisely how I felt at my first traditional mass, actually. Felt the sense of participation that I never experienced in the previous 4 years, or what was it, 2.5 years or whatever, going to mass in the Novus Ordo, which is the only thing I knew at that point. So I thought it was rather fascinating. And of course, as I went on to discover, less than 13% of the prayers, orations, collects, post-communions, antiphons, etc., are, and then the ordinary, are in the new mass from the
Right.
old. A lot of stuff is composed on the fly, and they told a lot of lies about it, and they expected you to believe it because there's no internet, so you couldn't verify it. The liturgical scholar Greg DePipo was on a podcast on 1 Peter 5, actually, with Timothy Flanders, and this was back, I think, 2 years ago. And he was saying at that time that when he was talking to someone, they say, "Oh, well, all those prayers, they come from the Gelasian Sacramentary," and and at the time, Dr. DePipo, he wasn't able to stop and look this up, and he explains, in that time it was just kind of, wow, okay, I guess that's so, because, well, you can't just walk into the Bibliotheca Apostolica and say, hey, show me your Gelasian Missal. There's only one, and it's Sanctus Sacramentary, as to say. There's only one, and it's 1,300 years old, so you can't just walk in and start picking it up and scrounging through. But he said, but then there's the internet, and now I can look at it on the internet. I can see none of these prayers are in the Gelasian Sacramentary, at least not in the form that shows up in the Novus Ordo. There might be a piece from them here, a piece from them there. The Eucharistic prayer too, the canon of Hippolytus. You find out there's only 18 fragmentary words from the supposed canon of Hippolytus, and there's never any evidence that whatever his canon actually was, we don't know, had any usage in the Roman rite of Mass. And there's none. So you have that, and they say, yeah, let's use this, and it becomes the normative Eucharistic prayer in the world, which, again, Paul VI called them novelties in the Constitution Missale Romanum. He calls these things novelties because it is entirely novel to have all these multiplicity of Eucharistic prayers just composed on the fly and shoehorned into the rite. The Eastern rites don't have that. The Eastern rites, each liturgy has an anaphora, their version of the canon. And Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which is the one that, if you're familiar with the Eastern Divine Liturgies, that's the most common one. A lot of the Greek churches also use the Liturgy of St. Basil on certain days, and that anaphora is mostly similar. There's a few variations, because Chrysostom is keeping close to what had been received. And again, there's the anaphoras of different rites. There's one. And Paul VI explicitly calls it a novelty. It's a brand new thing. This wasn't in the old missal.
Right.
All these
he literally called his missal a new rite. A new rite.
Yeah, and it's funny, people, because there's people running around today causing division. It's just the Mass. It's just Mass. You can't say Tridentine Mass or traditional Mass and Novus Ordo. They're all Mass. You're causing division by using those terms. Like the Pope himself used these terms, and Pope Leo is using these terms, by the way. So are you going to say that he's division and polarization? I mean, I would argue that he is, but in an entirely different way, than what these people mean when they try to argue. You can never say these terms, because I'm sorry, that's just contrary to logic. People need to differentiate things by categories and by names, and it's by no means derisive or wrong to categorize something properly by giving it a name, and in order to note its differences and distinction. So these very clunky terms, like, in the Mass as it was before Vatican, and have to say it that way every single time to differentiate from the Mass after Vatican II or the conciliar Mass. No, you can't say conciliar. That sounds derisive. Okay, the Mass of Paul VI. I don't know. What do you want me to say here? It's just easier. Traditional Mass or Tridentine Mass, if you want to say it that way, and in the Novus Ordo. It's just, and Novus Ordo is so. Bishops have used it, Episcopal conferences have used it. Paul VI called it a new rite. I mean, I'm sorry.
It's a term. It simply means the new order of Mass, which is what the Missal says. Yeah. So
it's
before we go on to our next portion of the interview, I just wanted to mention, so I think when he talks about there being opportunities to sit down and discuss, my guess is that what he's referring to as ideology, ultimately the requirement to sense the council in order to have approved traditional Latin masses has always been the same. You have to accept every jot and tittle of Vatican II. And I don't think that's not going to change under Leo, because let's recall what he said at day 3. I would like us to renew together today our complete, not partial, complete commitment to the path that the Universal Church has now followed for decades in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. And he thinks that Pope Francis has provided the master plan for that in Evangelii Gaudium, which is a terrible document. So, and I think the point, and I hosted a roundtable a couple of weeks ago on my channel about what do we do about Vatican II. We have no obligation to accept what the council itself said is not definitive teaching. These novelties, which we're going to get into now, ecumenism, interreligious dialogue, all of these sorts of things that certainly seem very difficult to reconcile with the traditional teaching of the church, if not impossible. We don't have the obligation to accept these things, and we certainly shouldn't be accepting them in order to get the traditional Latin Mass as a prize or a cookie or something. You know what I mean? Like,
and there's another thing
need to resist those. We need to resist those novelties, those ambiguities, and those errors.
Let me read the closing bit on this section here again. They don't even want to talk about it. That's just a problem in itself. So we first choose the they, and are you really going to be able to sit down with the groups? They don't even want to talk about it. That's a problem in itself. It means we're into ideology now. We're no longer into the experience of church communion. That's one of the issues on the agenda. So you have Father James Martin, who has just met with the Holy Father. And of course, he's, comes out, showing the pictures, and he praised and, said everything, supported my work and everything. You look at James Martin's work, is James Martin going to receive the teaching of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, let alone the entire tradition on, acronym acts and behavior? No. So he's not going to accept the actual Catholic teaching on sexuality and sexual morality. His books clearly don't. He's just recently endorsed a book that is utterly blasphemous against the Holy Family, arguing that Mary was not a virgin and that Jesus was the product of St. Joseph. And it's like from, I don't know what dingbat scholar, again, it was someone, professor I had in college, who said it's an idea so stupid only a PhD could think of it. Right? But and James Martin's just endorsed this book. Is he into ideology? Absolutely, he is. Is synodality an ideology? You bet your bottom dollar it is. Is Vatican II, has that become an ideology? Dollars to donuts, it is an ideology. Everything, if you want to use the word ideology as in you're following, I guess, what is the formal definition of ideology? I mean, he seems to be using it in more colloquial senses. Oh, these people put the cart before the horse. They're thinking, they're adhering to this and not the whole thing. But ideology, you're following principles, in it through their consequence. And so everything is an ideology if you want to get down to it. And it's not discordant that you can be in communion with the church and have an ideology toward a certain thing. The question is that ideology good or not?
And it's a very simple. I was just going to say, it's a very simple reason why we cling to the traditional Latin Mass, because we want to cling to the traditional Catholic faith. That's the connection that he doesn't seem to understand, and that even conservatives in general don't seem to understand. It's ultimately about the faith. It's about doctrine. It's not just about aesthetics. We want the traditional Mass because it expresses the traditional faith. That's the point that they're missing.
And again, like I said, I don't think he has much experience of either the traditional Mass or talking to clergy who celebrate it, let alone the faithful who desire it. So otherwise, it would be if he had a real understanding of that, it's all in different terms. So I think it's just the thing. Hey, here's the church. This is the church, and this is the church we got now. You guys have to be with the church, and that's just what it is. And there's in his mind, there's no disconnect or discordance between what the church has always never believed and what synodality proposes in terms of the nature and structure of the church. So that it's I guess it's not at all surprising, honestly. Predicted on our last program that as everything was going down in Charlotte, that he would do absolutely nothing to stop what was going on there. Now, I would still love to be proven wrong about that. But, he's not going to do it because he doesn't understand why anyone wants the traditional mass. And these are the bishops that he appointed when he was in the Congregation for Clergy. And presumably still supports because he's not doing anything or saying anything in regard to them. So I'm gonna say that it's going forward, don't expect a revision of Traditionis Custodes. Don't expect that. It's already become a self-fulfilling prophecy. With trads, like Cardinal Burke was out there. Trads need to shut up on the internet or something like to that effect. he said it a little more nicely than that, but
right.
It's we need to show a good face to the Holy Father, and
be on your best behavior.
Self-fulfilling prophecy, because then when inevitably nothing happens or worse things happen, then it'll be, see, it was all your fault. This kind of victim shaming, blaming the victim. It's like, yeah, are there people online that shouldn't be saying the kind of things or speak disrespectfully, like against charity? And yeah, there are. Of course there are. Everywhere in everything. Let's talk about the Novus Ordo. Let's talk about people in the mainstream of the church who argue against charity, who get on and you see trads, and they call them schismatics, and then say talking to people who go to mass and communion with their bishop, and then say the most absurd and ridiculous caricatures that are absolutely uncharitable. Against mocking large families, mocking wearing of veils, and you see people in the mainstream of the church will do this on Twitter, on Fedbook, on these places. Where's a word about the charity there? There is equally as much, if not more, hostility.
Yeah, they do it with impunity and without any consequences whatsoever. This is a good comment from a local friend of mine, Aaron. He says, will there be a reasonable discussion with the Pope regarding the advantages of the TLM without addressing the deficiencies of the Novus Ordo? I don't see it happening unless the SSPX does it. I think that is an interesting point. I'm very interested to see how things go between the SSPX and Pope Leo. I assume at some point there will be a meeting, because that was kind of one of the anomalies of the Francis pontificate, is that for whatever reason he really seemed to take a liking to them, and extended faculties for absolving and confession, and instructed local bishops to allow them to witness marriages canonically and all of this stuff. So I hope, and I admire their superior general, who was elected a few years ago now, quite a few years ago, I guess, Father Davide Pagliarani, I think. I mean, when Traditionis Custodes came out, I remember him writing an incredibly powerful and inspiring statement in response to all of that. Like, we need to be willing to lay down our lives for this mass, the traditional mass, because it expresses the traditional faith. I don't have a direct quote from it or anything. I'm just remembering. But so yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see the role that Divine Providence has in store for the SSPX to bring some resolution to this issue. But you mentioned earlier about the issue of synodality. That's the next topic I have on the docket for us to look at from this interview.
You know what we need? We need that clip from we need that clip from Pee Wee Herman. What is today's magic word? Unless you grew up in the 80s, or you know what I'm talking about. We need that Pee Wee Herman go over to the robot, get the magic word. He opens it up. Synodality.
I can't do his laugh, but so yeah, he was actually asked to define, the interviewer asked him to define synodality. How do you define it? Which I think was a very good question, because we still haven't gotten a coherent definition of the term, really. And he doesn't necessarily provide one, in my opinion, either. He kind of describes it, but he can't actually give a definition, because nobody can. It's just this weird kind of, I don't know, ephemeral, mystical, whatever buzzword. So he says synodality is an attitude, an openness, a willingness to understand. Um, I think so. It's almost sounds like pop psychology. Oh, that's kind of how it strikes me. Like we need to sit down and meet in the middle, and reach across the aisle. All of these platitudes. I think that synodality is a way of describing how we can come together and be a community and seek communion as a church, as if we don't already have it somehow, so that it's a church whose primary focus is not on an institutional hierarchy. That's a big part of all this, trying to make it very egalitarian, but rather on a sense of we together, our church. It's an attitude which I think can teach a lot to the world today. A little bit ago, we were talking about polarization. I think this is sort of an antidote. So he kind of sees these like listening sessions, discussion sessions, which is basically what the synod was, sitting around round tables and just sharing a bunch of people sharing their opinions on things. He thinks that
Sounds
that's
more like a struggle
the
session.
antidote. What was that?
That sounds more like a struggle session.
Yeah. He says, I think this is a way of addressing some of the greatest challenges that we have in the world today. I think the way to address the challenges in the world today is to preach and teach the Catholic faith boldly and clearly, with zeal for God and for souls. That's the answer, not all of this roundtable discussions.
Well, precisely, because again, we talked about the traditional mass expressing a different ecclesiology from what is claimed called the Vatican II ecclesiology. And this, particular quote, it's all about listening. It's about sitting down and talking, and it's not a focus on an institutional hierarchy. Or back when he was, taking answers, when he was simply cardinal prevost, he, said, we're not looking for concrete answers. We remember we played that quote, that clip last time. And here it's we're going to get together and talk again. What is the divine constitution of the church? It is constituted to save souls, right? By bringing men to the participation in the redemption of Jesus Christ through the sacraments, right faith, and through the institutional hierarchy. That is the institutional church, outside of which none can be saved. So that is its nature. And if the church is going to dialogue with someone, it's as the institutional church, offering again the gospel of Jesus Christ to the world and saying, you must embrace this. And the fact that people don't embrace it, that doesn't, we have to stop talking about it in order to get, that's been the thing with ecumenism, right? Since Vatican II, is all this talking, but then Protestants like, well, what are we actually here talking about? Oh, it's all about dialogue. Well, dialogue to what? And conservatives then to try to reconcile all this with the tradition, say, well, dialogue toward bringing everyone to the Catholic Church. And then, well, we're out of here. I mean, just a little thing like back in 2001, when Cardinal Ratzinger issued Dominus Jesus, again, with John Paul II's authority, declaring that, Christ alone, you can only have salvation by believing in Christ. And although a bit weakly, could have been more forcefully expressed, that, that the Catholic Church is a church of Jesus Christ. So immediately, the Jews start pulling out of interreligious dialogue, and the Muslims start pulling out of religious dialogue. There's complaints from Protestants about Dominus Jesus, and Ratzinger and John Paul II both start backpedaling. They both start kind of recommitting to dialogue.
Even in the document itself, they're basically, even in that document itself, as I recall, they're still
like I said,
trying
it's a weak affirmation.
Still trying to justify the novel expressions and ambiguities of the council and trying to shoehorn it into an orthodox meaning. But this actually is a great segue into our next portion of the interview that we're going to talk about, is his statements on ecumenism and interreligious dialogue. So he says, I think that the recognition from the time of the Second Vatican Council of trying to work towards an authentic unity of all Christians has to be one of the goals of the church today. Certainly nothing wrong with that. We should be inviting all non-Catholic Christians to rejoin Mother Church. one of the deepest wounds in the life of the church today, he says, is the fact that as Christians, we're not, that we're divided. So, yes, it's a tragedy we're divided, but it's not actually a wound in the life of the church. The church, one of the church's 4 marks is unity. It's one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Those are the 4 marks. The church can never lose her mark of unity just because certain members break off or they're Christians who are not attached to her formally. That's not a wound on her unity. Um, and I want to, so this sounds pretty much like what we've been hearing the last several decades from several successive popes, especially like John Paul II, for example, and certainly Pope Francis. I think also Paul VI, and also Benedict XVI, all of them really. What they need to return to is the clear teaching of Pius XI in his 1928 encyclical Mortalium Animos, which was all about on religious unity. And he says in that document, paragraph 10, he's talking about why the Apostolic See has never allowed its subjects to take part in the assemblies of non-Catholics. This is when ecumenism was starting to come into vogue in Protestant circles back in the 1920s. This is before the Catholic Church ever started participating in all of that nonsense. And he gave the reason. He said, for the union of Christians can only be promoted by promoting the return to the one true Church of Christ of those who are separated from it. For in the past they have unhappily left it. To the one true Church of Christ, we say, which is visible to all, and which is to remain according to the will of its author, exactly the same as he instituted it. That is true ecumenism. That is the purpose of dialogue, is to bring people into the true church. And if it's anything other than that, then it's a problem. He goes on to say on these 2 topics, I may be too presumptuous, so now he's getting more into the interreligious stuff, but I dare say that already in the first couple of months, the relationship with the Jewish community as such has improved a bit. And we covered in our first video that statement that, who was it, the ADL or somebody posted, the official invitation to come to his installation mass or his coronation mass, I guess, as the new Roman pontiff, was sent to the Jewish people, and that he had every intention of continuing the legacy of Nostra Aetate and all of that stuff. So I assume that's what he's referring to, that kind of stuff. And he, as a side note, he was asked in the interview about the situation in Gaza, and I do applaud him for speaking out against what's going on there. But unfortunately, he did say in the interview that he's not comfortable committing to calling what's going on there a genocide, which I think is very unfortunate, because that's clearly what's going on: ethnic cleansing, genocide, being carried out by the state of Israel. So anyway, just kind of a sidebar there. But in regard to the interreligious stuff, he says, I think Francis, specifically with Islam, made great strides in overcoming some of the barriers that had existed because of specific historical things in recent and further past, kind of like Islam's teaching that they should spread their false religion by the edge of a sword, that kind of thing. Is that what we're talking about? But he says, for the good of world peace, there's no other way to go in this sense. I also think he has Francis's document on human fraternity in mind, because as we'll get to later, he quoted very positively. He promotes that document. He did back in May, and he has done so again just last week. This which contains the heretical statement that God wills the plurality and diversity of religions. So he thinks that making these compromises and just talking with people, that's the way to world peace, as opposed to the kingship of Christ. I mean, that's very concerning to me. What do you think?
Right. Well, again, I guess what then is the raison d'etre of ecumenism and interreligious dialogue? Is it to advance the mission of the church, the oneness of the church and the salvation of souls? Or is it for these purely secular aims? And that quote would suggest these are purely for secular aims. And I've seen this, ever since 9/11, we have to dialogue with Islam, otherwise the world's going to be a cinder. Well, why do we, what is dialoguing with Islam going to accomplish? And actually, even within that interview, Cardinal Prevost quotes, Pope Leo now quotes Pope Francis as saying, well, dialogue with Islam is difficult because there's so many different groups and sects, because there's dozens of Islamic sects. People have heard, of Shiites and Sunnis.
Right.
But
They don't have a principle of unity, just like
people probably heard about Alawites now since Syria, but there's so many more, and
right.
and that have their schools of fiqh, that is their Islamic canon law. Essentially, they have different doctrines around certain points, and it's like you could dialogue perfectly well with someone representing Islamic communities, say in Turkey, and that is a completely different conversation than Sunni communities in, say, Egypt, or again, or Shiites in Iran and Iraq, and
it's no different than dialoguing with Protestants or Orthodox, because none of them have a divinely instituted principle of unity for their groups.
Right. If you could dialogue with just some hypothetical situation, let's even say that the purpose of this dialogue was to bring souls into the Catholic Church, and if you dialogue with, say, First Baptist Church of Montgomery, Alabama, and you convince the pastor and the people of the truth of the Catholic faith, right? And that entire church came into the Catholic Church or something. Great. Now, what about the Second Baptist Church in the same town? And it's like, it's not, okay, what did we actually accomplish here? It's a similar thing with Islam. And I think what the Pope even quotes in this interview with respect to the problems of dialoguing with Islam, I think show the futility of it, honestly, is that at best, if your goal is world peace, you can talk to some Islamic leaders and whatnot. But the other thing, too, is the way that Islam's weaponized by Western elites to attack a lot of our communities. Because you look at Islam in its actual course in the 20th century, it's mostly on a secularizing trend. It's not on the jihadist trend. The jihadist end is basically how disparate elements within those societies have been utilized by Western intelligence to accomplish various geopolitical goals. Like you look at the CIA in Afghanistan, for example, is an obvious one. Operating is all declassified, but Operation Cyclone. They get the Egyptians and the Syrians to empty out their jails to send people that the CIA would then train in Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. So the idea that Brzezinski's plan of making a Vietnam-level boondoggle for the Soviets to bankrupt them, right? And by and large, it did exhaust the Soviet army. It definitely helped contribute to the Soviet Union's decline. There's no doubt about that. But again, that continues, and the use of Islamic, militants to give them arms and funding they could never get on their own. I don't even think Islam would be a threat without Western intelligence, period. Not because they would just, roll out the carpets for us. It'd be nice when we go over there, and but even within their own communities, most, and I'm just thinking there's a little more familiarity with, like most Muslims, say like Jordan, or even in Egypt, they want to drink coffee and smoke some shisha, smoke a cigarette, go home to their two wives if they can afford them, or three, and that's the highest aim in life. And they'll cheer on the home team. They might even get excited if they see some terrorist thing that blows up people in some place where they've been told we don't like those people. What they actually know about, they don't want to get up and join up. They want to kind of live quiet.
They have no desire to actually participate in jihad.
That doesn't mean they like us. That doesn't mean that they're suddenly friendly to us or anything like that. But they don't really want to do that. Small disparate groups that if we, were strong and weren't destroying our cultures from the inside, not just through vices, but through direct government action to undermine our societies, they wouldn't even pose a serious threat, right? And so, and again, that's another side point. So as the geopolitics sit today with Islam, what you can ask by what Pope Leo says, what in the world are you actually going to accomplish if you get, the various mosques in Turkey to sign some little, statement of joint faith, or what? Does that mean all their members are going to say, yeah, we like Catholics now? No. Is that going to change how Catholics are in Turkey? No.
Right. Not to mention the Islamic doctrine of taqiyya, which basically means that they're allowed to lie when they're not in the majority, and in order to advance the cause of Islam through deception, that's allowed in their religion.
Taqiyya, it's actually properly a Shiite doctrine, but it's more recently been included in the Sunni schools of fiqh as well. So yeah, so you've got that as well. And how do you know they're not being entirely deceptive? And of course, the church had to deal with this in the past too, with the Cathars. The Cathars had very similar types of doctrine, that they were allowed to pronounce oaths with the fingers crossed, essentially, like put an oath on one thing, but mean specifically their oath on this, not on anything else. And so they would, the inquisitor like Bernard Gui and other inquisitors would say, well, I'll make you swear as many oaths and to be sure you're not lying. Because so often Cathars would lie, then they get excused of some light penance, and then go back and take up arms to fight against the king and the church and whatnot over in Languedoc. And you have so much revision, like bad revisionism, political revisionism of the Cathar Crusade. But they were a really dangerous force. They weren't just people who had their own ideas about things. And like, what was that one Jehovah's Witness who wrote a book on it? I can't remember her name. It was like The Great Controversy or something like that. And they did this old Protestant polemic of depicting the Cathars as these good Bible-believing Christians. Then once Protestants got into it and found out who the Cathars really were, they quietly dropped that whole polemic because they're like, we actually don't want to associate with these people.
Mm-hmm.
But now that's gotten a good bit of secular revisionism on political lines, not on documentary lines, where they say, "Oh, the Cathars are these wonderful people, and the church snubbed them out for believing something different." That was because it took up arms and killed pilgrims and killed bishops and killed priests and killed royal officials, and that's why they had a crusade, because it was a dangerous heresy that had to not.
And speaking of crusade. Speaking of the Crusades, that's actually on the next slide. He mentioned it in a very negative light, which I definitely wanted to touch on because we're both very interested in history, and you're much more knowledgeable about it than I am. So I wanted to get your take on it. But he says, "I believe very strongly in Jesus Christ and believe that that's my priority because I'm the Bishop of Rome and successor of Peter." I mean, that's encouraging language, but based on the other things that we've seen, it's kind of empty words at this point. And the Pope needs to help people understand, especially Christians, Catholics, that this is who we are. And I think that's a beautiful mission. When that mission, however, becomes distorted, thrown into ideologies, there's that word again. I don't know what he means by that exactly. Misunderstood, then things become more complicated. He seems to think of like the traditional mission of the church of proselytizing and converting people to being an ideology. I mean, that's kind of how that seems to be the case in my mind. But anyway, he says, but I'm not afraid to say I believe in Jesus Christ and that he died on the cross and rose from the dead, and that we together are called to share that message. Wonderful. But he says, to say that doesn't mean that I'm going to disrespect or offend or set a crusade against people of other religions, because that's just not the answer. We've learned that through history.
Yeah, it's I'll give him this. The Pope here is speaking in, again, the colloquial way that modern man who's expected to be, with modern views. We don't do that kind of stuff anymore. These were bad things that were done back then. That's a very modern liberal, and I say liberal in the sense of like academic climate, view to have with an excess of, I guess, humaneness that, is sometimes like a false humaneness that is taken, like being nice, really. We don't want to talk like that. Was bad what they did back then. Without himself going, I don't know let's see, with Pope Francis, it was easy enough. He's not an historian, did not have good historical knowledge of a lot of things, and would just speak with something that he probably heard at university or somebody say offhand that helped him form his opinion about the subject. I don't know what Pope Leo's training in history is or is not. Was it just a class or two in university? Has it just been general reading on certain subjects? Is he more interested in this or that? I don't know. I couldn't say. But based on how he phrases that, again, it's coming from this kind of modern academic, false humaneness, where we want to say, that was always, violence is always bad in any possible way. It's not justified. And
And the
we wouldn't want
implication is
to,
that the Crusades were
yeah,
like aggressive offensive wars, which is the opposite of the
right.
truth. They were defensive
Yeah, and
wars.
so which suggests he hasn't studied it very carefully, honestly, because I mean, even secular scholars will acknowledge on both sides of it. It was a movement for the protection of the holy sites that gradually, especially once knowledge of the fact that the Fatimid Caliph in Egypt had ordered the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre to be demolished. This is what incensed Christians in Europe when they heard about it, and that's what got increased like the desire that we need to do something to protect the holy places. There's also political gains, defending our coast from Saracen pirates, Islamic piracy. We can punch a hole in the Saracen over there, it might slow down the bit of this piracy. Then it's also
Right.
geopolitical expedience, because the Roman Emperor in Constantinople had restored relations with the Pope, and that had been broken down for about 30 years. And even though the Pope was fighting for Roman territory, and that is Byzantine territory in South Italy, that is Pope Leo IX, dies in a Norman jail, right? So, but just the same, the Comnenus come to the throne and they say, we need the West. And they're recovering after a really bad military disaster at Manzikert. And they need mercenaries for a campaign to try to drive the Turks out of Iconium. So he writes a letter to Pope Urban II asking for mercenaries, and then he preaches on this. He takes and receives it as divine confirmation that the feelings of Christendom, toward defending the holy places have, and now this is the occasion. And so that's when he preached calls for what we now call the Crusades. They didn't use that term back then. It comes later. It actually comes from crucisignationti, marked with the cross, which actually wasn't like you see in artwork or video games where they got the big red cross on their tunic. It would actually be like a little red cross you would wear. And up here, or any cross, actually, it wasn't even always red, depending on the availability of dyes. So that's how, the Crusades came about. And you had people kind of going on their own without official sanction. You had the People's Crusade, right? That unfortunately gets, completely destroyed when they go over against the Turks. And then the Turks like, oh, this is what they're sending against us. This will be easy. But then a real army comes in, led by Norman commanders like Bohemond and other people who had serious military prowess. And then the Turks don't do so well. And the First Crusade is able to make its way with a number of miracles attested to, and even commemorated liturgically for a long time.
Right.
That with in terms like Bach and even in Jerusalem. So then there's other things. There's bad things that happen, like always in military campaigns, like the actual slaughter when they do take Jerusalem, which even would have killed some Christians along with Arabs. And so
we're certainly not saying that nothing bad ever happened during the Crusades, but I think the point is that in principle, there's nothing opposed. Yeah, I was just going to say, in principle, there's nothing opposed to the gospel with the Crusades. Like, it's not an anti-Christian or anti-Catholic thing that was contrary to the gospel or the mission of the church.
Right, and the thing is too, like when the church preaches the crusade, this is a geopolitical reaction to the encroachment of on the West. You have them pressing in Spain. You have them, conquering, all this territory used to belong to the Eastern Roman Empire. And then you've got Islamic piracy all throughout the Mediterranean. I mean, as much as the Romans could call the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea, our ocean, the Saracens could have done that just as easily in the 11th century, because it was between the navies of the caliphates and the piracy, a lot of it predominantly is Islamic. So there are all kinds of good reasons. And, but then, so that's why I say this is kind of this modern generalizing liberal academic opinion that he may or may not have heard in class without, studying it much, or read offhand in whatever books he reads. And I don't know, but that's the reality of it. And so the kind of, it reminds me too of like this whole apology tour that the John Paul II struggle session, as it were, of apologizing for everything and numbering the Crusades in it. And it's like, we should always apologize for anything bad, but it's like, what is that? Apology by by people who didn't commit those acts to people who were not victims of those acts, for acts that were not sanctioned by the church, that people did because they were bad. It's like, do we need to have the Habsburgs apologizing for the sack of Rome. The Habsburgs today, who did not order it, and people of the city of Rome today who did not suffer under it. So, well, what good does that even accomplish? We can make historical judgments and say, yeah, it was bad, and Charles V, should have paid his troops better, so that wouldn't happen. Charles V also took quite a bit of advantage of that situation, and so even though he condemned it, he said, well, won't let a crisis go to waste. Do we need to make every Habsburg apologize for that? No. So why does the Pope need to come out and apologize because soldiers on the ground did bad things at certain points that were not sanctioned by the church? Because the liberal academic opinion, which is formulating the John Paul II struggle session, as I call it, is that these were bad. The whole thing was bad. Any kind of violence, was bad. Okay, and so we should have just laid the Knights of Malta should have just laid down in 1565, and we should not, Pius V should not have formed the Holy League, preceding Lepanto in 1571, and there again, we shouldn't have the Second Holy League and have Eugene of Savoy utterly destroy the Turks at Zenta. Now, we should never have done any of that because we should all just be peaceful and let the entire world be Turkish at this point, I guess. I don't know. That's the consequence of the kind of thinking that goes into statements like that. Irrespective of that, I don't think the Holy Father means to involve all that in, but that's the logical following of the principles that are kind of being imbibed there. Yeah, we're not going to send a crusade against. Yeah, in a modern political context, the church is not going to call a crusade and call all Christians in all Western countries to come up and attack an Islamic nation as if we're like a political entity. No, that's not going to happen. But embroiling
I think
means, but
I think my main takeaway from what he said, I'll just put it back on the screen. He says, he talks about the mission of the church, preaching the gospel. But he does, again, even like with most of the popes since Vatican II, their understanding of the mission of the church doesn't necessarily equate to the traditional mission, which is to actually convert people to the Catholic faith. They just kind of have this affirmist kind of general preaching of the gospel and hoping that people will choose Christ or whatever, but it doesn't necessarily mean them actually entering the visible Catholic Church. So he says, to say that his personal faith, to say that expressing his personal faith in Christ and the gospel doesn't mean that I'm going to disrespect or offend or set a crusade against people of other religions. Maybe not in a physical sense, but we should all be on a spiritual crusade to save souls. That is the mission of the church.
Right. And it's like, in my own personal life, I'm not a good debater. And so I usually have conversations, dialogue, if you will. And I've had a lot of times, I've had good conversations with Protestants, but there's no doubt about what I'm about. And there's no doubt about what they're about. And, I obviously want their conversion and I know they want mine. It is as simple as that. It is all straight up without kind of this anomalous language, and so if the Holy Father means, we're going to have respect for these people and talk to them and invite them in, well, that's fine. But that's not exactly what he means, because we're devoting so much of the church's energy, gathering bishops, producing all these documents, going through massive amounts of expense to focus almost the entire church's mission on this dialogue that's, and you know what it is? Speaking of ideology, synodality, since he won't define it, I will. It's a verbal virus, bringing an ideology that is against bringing the gospel of Jesus Christ to people because we don't want to cause offense, because our goal is actually political unity and, be happy and feel nice about each other. That's what and so if you go back 20 years, 25 years ago, Christopher Ferrara and Thomas Woods published The Great. And in there, Christopher Ferrara called the ecumenism a verbal virus, something that lacks specific, definition, but everyone appeals to in all possible things and say, we must do this. We need to have this. And the synodality has taken ecumenism over. You don't hear, it's interesting he even mentions ecumenism at all, but that's like a side point now. Now it's evolved. Synodality is your new verbal virus that everyone must give. And that's going to solve all the problems. That's going to fix everything. So theology is a sacred science. And I'd like to recall to philosophy of science. Karl Popper makes this argument, and I think it governs theology as a sacred science just as much as it governs the hard sciences. Popper argues in his various writings on philosophy of science that the more something is said to cause all these different things, the more you say something causes everything, the more it causes nothing. The more that it realized that this is the thing that's not a real cause. It's not the actual thing we should be studying, because anything that can be said to be the cause of everything, and you solve this, you solve everything, what you're really saying is we don't have any defined principle, any way to test it, any way to falsify it. It just becomes this excuse that we can, now say it's the cause of everything, and we're going to focus on that. So that's essentially what climate change is. Climate change causes colder winters, except when it causes warmer winters, and it causes heavier rains, but also causes lighter rains, and it basically causes everything. Which really means it causes nothing. There's more localized specific events that are causes of all these different things that have to be studied and tested to come to those conclusions. In theology, I would say utter the exact same thing, is that the more we say this one thing is what we need to be focusing on, that's going to fix all these problems, that's the solution to everything, the more I'm going to say it's a solution to absolutely nothing. Because specific problems in the church, ideologies, as you will, whatever they are, they come about because of specific causes, and those causes need to be addressed. If there's polarization, synodality is not going to fix it, as well as fix relations with non-Catholic religions, as well as fix problems in the church and liturgy wars and bad bishops and the sex abuse crisis. And no, synodality is not going to fix all those things or any of those things, because it's undefined. It becomes this anomalous thing, and you can say, we're putting all our problems here. If we do this enough, all those problems will go away. And that's just simply not the way things actually work in real life. If traditionalism really is a problem, and it seems to be from where Pope Leo sits, then there's obviously a genesis of it and a solution that's going to come about through different principles. Or again, German bishops blessing gay unions, which he's criticized. In this interview, actually, he criticized that. He claims that's an abuse of fiducia supplicans. I would actually argue that's the very thing he was decided to do. But beside that,
right.
That is synodality is not going to solve that. Solving the problem. You guys are embracing a false notion of sexuality and giving authentic Catholic teaching on this subject, following it up with discipline, like, say, removing these bishops at something faster than the speed of a drunken elephant wandering around in the wilderness. Might actually do something useful, or at least removing his bishops half as fast as you remove any bishop that is seen to be, he has a seminaries full and is supporting the traditional mass. The things like that might actually be in way, and so on and so forth, to every other problem in the church. So that's where I think absolutely you have synodality is the commitment of the church to a geopolitical, secular aim that is not part of the church's divine constitution or the mission of Christ. So basically, it's being nice, to bring it back to the liberal view of crusading and such. Right. And so, but I've bloviated. So why don't you take us to where we need to go next?
Sure. This is an interesting definition from my friend Aaron. Synodality is the democratization of the teaching church with aspirations to affect the governing and eventually sanctifying church. That's interesting. I think there could be a lot of truth to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. If you look at what was it that Pope Francis had said, is that, or it was said.
Here's another way of putting it. Synodality is fiddling while Rome burns.
There we go. Couldn't agree more. There is a line, I don't remember if Pope Francis said it, so I don't want to say he said this, but it was said during his pontificate by people close to him, which is that, well, the doctrine can't change, but the discipline can change, because the discipline's not doctrine. I don't know if you recall that. If Spadaro said that, or what have you.
Yeah, that was his way of ramming. I mean, that's basically a Amoris Laetitia in a nutshell, that we're not technically changing the doctrine, but we're changing the praxis or the discipline.
Right.
Yeah.
And, and that whole notion of the democratization of the church, the changing attitudes. So in the end, you could end up writing a document that allows these things that in itself will be, like I predicted on female deacons, that what they'll do, although it didn't come to pass like I thought I did, so I was wrong about when they would do it. But I said that what they will do is they'll write a document that notes the limitations and notes that women are ever formally ordained in ministry, but now gives authority to ordain, in a non-sacred manner, is not to be considered sacred orders, women
Right.
to a women's diaconate of sorts, right?
It'll have all the trappings
And
of the actual diaconate.
yeah, the next day they will be wearing vestments and on the altar, probably even celebrating or something, who knows, and preaching at the masses, and you'll be told, oh yeah, this is fine. And then even mainstream conservatives will be like, that's not what the document says. And then Rome will say, basically do nothing or give some corrective, and then it'll keep going, just like communion in the hand, just like every other thing down the
just like fiducia supplicans. So they'll say, oh, we're not blessing the union, we're just blessing the couple who happens to be in a
and even
union.
And Pope Leo seems to be of that opinion. All it did was bless people. It just says we can bless anybody. All the document was meant to say. And then look at these Germans taking it to, well, the level that anyone who would have read a plain reading of that document, that's what it says, to do precisely what the German bishops are doing, or again, what James Martin is doing.
I love what Archbishop Vigano had a really witty response to fiducia supplicans. I should have gotten the screenshot ready. I thought about it, but so he posted, jokingly, but very, wryly, like posted a picture of Pope Francis and somebody was showing him a bicycle. And the caption for the photo that he put on there was, I'm not blessing the bicycle, I'm just blessing the tires, or something like which is analogous to fiducia supplicans. So I'm not blessing the union, I'm just blessing these two people who happen to be a couple and happen to be in what they think to be a union, So I know, and you mentioned in passing a few minutes ago the issue of clergy sexual abuse. That's another topic discussed in this interview that I definitely want to touch on. I think it's very important. And then there's one other before we start wrapping up. Thank you, everybody who's joining us. I know we've been going for a little over an hour and a half now, and we've got close to 300 joining us live right now. So thank you so much. Please if you're enjoying our discussion, our ranting, please give us a like, a thumbs up, and share the video on your social media accounts. We greatly appreciate that. So here is what Pope
checks, get the real treading griff going.
So here's what he has to say, part of what he has to say on the subject of clergy sexual abuse. The first statement just bowls me over, considering that Pope Francis is the one who rehabilitated Theodore McCarrick and made him his point man for the Vatican China deal, which is actually the final topic we're going to discuss from the interview shortly. So he said, I think Pope Francis had some very good insight into this issue. Yeah, the irony is so rich.
Brought back Monsignor Inzulli, who had raped a couple of kids, and then he's back in his clerics. He'd been like an in-your-face to all his critics, and then was convicted by the Italian state of subsequent crimes against children, and then had to be re-laicized. That's why Francis had very good insight in this issue. Or again, Zenchetta, other people that were protected in the Vatican from prosecution in Argentina.
Father Rupnik, obviously.
He had great insight into Father Rupnik,
So anyway. He goes on to, so he says, Pope Francis had some very good insight into this issue. He recognized the importance of the issue, but at the same time recognized that the issue of sexual abuse cannot become the center focus of the church. Now, remember what he said earlier about, let me pull up this slide. Earlier, he was, in regard to ecumenism, he was saying, see if I got the right one here, that it's one of the primary wounds. Here we go. One of the deepest wounds in the life of the church today is the fact that as Christians we're divided. Well, respectfully, Holy Father, I would say one of the deepest actual wounds of the church is decades of homosexual predation, and it's completely in the sin that cries to heaven for vengeance. The sin of Sodom has infested, especially the hierarchy, the bishops, but also the priests. That is a real wound in the mystical body of Christ that needs to be addressed. in a very serious manner, like in the way that, for example, St. Pius V did, or St. Peter Damian did. So to say, that it shouldn't be, a center focus of the church, well, it's destroying the church's human element right now, and something has to be done. Something has to be done.
Right. I mean, the mere fact that the majority, as he says, the majority of people who are committed to the church, priests and bishops, religious, have never abused anyone. The fact of that, with so much abuse, it doesn't matter that it's a minority. You have a minority that has done a great deal of harm. And you have this perception particularly amongst the abuse victims themselves. And secondly, amongst the wider church. And thirdly, the people you want to dialogue with all the time in the world, that the church doesn't take this seriously. The church is still covering up, and that the church isn't doing enough. And
you're not identifying the root problem. That's the other main thing. They're not identifying the root problem, which is homosexuality. That, as Archbishop Vigano identified it many times, others have identified it. Even the official studies, like the John Jay, I think it was, college, identified that, what was it, like 81% of the victims were post-pubescent or pubescent males. I mean, this is clearly a problem of homosexuality.
Well, absolutely. And that's the thing. You want to stop polarization. I can't think of a better way to stop polarization than substantially dealing with the sex abuse crisis. And the problem is that, and again, why did we have fiducia supplicans? Well, it's been rumored and suggested that Cardinal Fernandez swings in a James Martin sort of way, which would not surprise me. I don't know if it's true. I hope it's not true. But the things, his mannerisms, things he does, writing a book about healing you with kisses, and there's allegations from his home country that this is the case. So, and then, he writes, because nobody in the acronym community was begging the church to give blessings as couples and stuff like that. The only thing they're advocating for is the church to recognize gay marriage and in LGBTQ issues, and not say that there's anything wrong with being that way or what have you, or with doing those acts. So that's what they want. So this whole thing with who's bringing it in? Well, gay clergy in high positions of power want stuff like this. Average people weren't asked pining for that. The church was not pining for fiducia supplicans or anything like that. So there, so you have that sort of thing. And then you've got all that. Actually, I've got a...
Yeah, let me put that up there.
Yeah, put that up. So this is an article that I saw referenced by Dr. Anthony Stein. If you don't follow him, find Return to Tradition, Dr. Stein. And so he highlighted this article, and I went and found it. This is from a man who was a Catholic priest, a Navy officer, and Jean Thomas Gamolka. And he was essentially booted out. He was laicized because he kept telling the bishops back in 2004, this is a homosexual problem. He also testified in Congress against, allowing, publicly homosexual servicemen and what have you and stuff. So anyway, if you go through this, I'm going to go over here to his second paragraph. And so this is attitudes cannot change doctrine. Okay. And so he has, various degrees in dogmatic theology he taught in seminary. So anyway, so here's what he says. Reading about the recent interview Pope Leo XIV gave to Crux senior correspondent Elise Ann Allen, I couldn't help but think of one of my former students, whose name was also Leo, one of 30 Third Order regular novices, from various East Coast dioceses, whom I taught in the first and second theology. Leo was the only seminarian whom I did not recommend for orders. I explained faculty members that my evaluation was not based on Leo's grades in my 3 courses, but stemmed from what I perceived as certain psychological and other limitations on his part. The other faculty members disagreed with my assessment, and Leo was retained. In response to a question about LGBTQ issues, Pope Leo said, people want the church doctrine to change, want attitudes to change. I think we have to change attitudes before we ever change doctrine, unquote. When I read that, I immediately thought, if Robert Prevost was my student and he maintained that position, I would never have recommended him for orders. Now, this man, by the way, as far as I know, is not a trad by any stripe. Just to put that out there. But anyway, continuing. As a dogmatic theologian, I taught my students that Catholic doctrine is based on the scriptures and tradition grounded in the natural law. Scripture provides divine revelation through sacred texts. Tradition encompasses the accumulated wisdom and teachings of the faith community, and the natural law presupposes an innate understanding of right and wrong attainable through human reason and observation of nature. Contrary to what Leo said during his interview, doctrine does not derive from people's attitudes, which seem akin to Pope Francis's push for synodality that involves listening, dialogue, and discernment. Interestingly, it was quote-unquote synodality as adopted by the German synodal way that led some German clergy to bless same-sex couples in opposition to the church's moral and doctrinal teaching on homosexuality. When Pope Francis promulgated Fiducia Supplicans, I argued in several articles that the genesis for the blessing of same-sex couples did not originate with the LGBTQ community. I opined that it was Pope Francis and Cardinal Victor Manuel Tucho, I don't know how you say it right.
I think Tucho, yep.
Fernandez, the prefect of the dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith, formerly the artist formerly known as the CDF, respectively accused by Cardinal Vigano and Sister Maria Lucia Carampadilla of having engaged in homosexual behavior, who were attempting to change the attitudes of Catholic laity and straight clergy about the Church's longstanding teachings on homosexuality. It was not at all a coincidence that pro-LGBTQ Reverend James Martin, FD, met on the more than one occasion with Pope Francis, as well as with Pope Leo XIV. It is also not surprising that Martin applauded Leo's remark that attitudes must change before doctrine.
That's essentially James Martin's whole shtick, is that we have to change the attitudes. Yeah.
So the last bit I'm going to read here is, so insofar as my research revealed an overwhelming number of closeted homosexuals in the episcopacy and priesthood, similar to conclusions drawn by Frederick Martel Darius Occo and other researchers, I argued that the psychosexual development of homosexual clergy, often the result of grooming experiences in seminaries, would not only affect their theology, preaching, teaching, and ministry, but would also make them less inclined to report or discipline priests who engage in sexual predation or homosexual conduct. A survivors network of those abused by priests, SNAP, may wish to consider this psychological handicap when it writes to church leaders like Pope Leo complaining, you could end the abuse crisis, you're choosing not to. And then he goes on to other things, and I'm going to skip over here. The idea of changing doctrine by changing people's attitudes is reminiscent of how homosexuals attempted in 1992 to change the Department of Defense homosexual exclusion policy. In arguing for a policy change, gay and lesbian activists who backed the election of President Bill Clinton attempted to conflate homosexual orientation with homosexual behavior, while the media, including Newsweek, falsely reported in September 1992, quote, gay men and lesbians expelled from the U.S. military each year because of sexual orientation, 1,000. Examination of records of the various military investigative services, NCIS, OCISD, and OSI, revealed that gays and lesbians were separated not because of their sexual orientation, but because of their behavior. They were either caught engaging in sexual acts or on government property, or they were reported for propositioning or assaulting a heterosexual service member or civilian government worker. While serving as the deputy chaplain of the U.S. Marine Corps, I testified before Congress in support of the DoD exclusion policy, distinguishing clearly between sexual orientation and behavior. In order to avoid the criticism that I was attempting to impose my religious beliefs on a secular institution, I based my arguments on the natural law. Testifying at the time in opposition to the policy was Mr. Lawrence Korb, Assistant Secretary of Defense under President Ronald Reagan. Korb was questioned by Arizona Senator John McCain, of infelicitous memory, but anyway, who pointed out that many of the laws found in our Constitution were grounded in a Judeo-Christian ethic, including our attitude toward homosexuality and adultery. When asked how the government could allow gays and lesbians to engage in homosexual acts while prosecuting heterosexuals for adultery, punishable under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ, Korb infamously responded that the prohibition against adultery would have to also be lifted. Surprise. And we get to the money quote here. Here we go. Where was the section I was looking for that I thought was... All right, let's go here. While the attempt to change the policy failed under President Clinton, it was later abrogated under President Barack Obama in 2010. The Obama administration intentionally misrepresented the DoD policy to be unjustly discriminatory based on sexual orientation, downplayed homosexual behavior, and covered up homosexual assaults in the military. Just Associated Press reported Nicole Winfield, reinterpreted the question posed to Pope Francis about Monsignor Batista Rica on the 2013 flight from Brazil. Rica, a close friend of the Pope, was caught engaging in homosexual behavior on various occasions. Instead of identifying that behavior as morally wrong and sinful, Francis lied, saying Rica's behavior was investigated and there was nothing of what had been alleged. Further, by saying, "Who am I to judge?" Francis took a very different position on behavior than Jesus took on adulterous behavior when he said to the woman caught in adultery, "Go in peace and avoid this sin." I mean, he's obviously taking liberty with the gospel text, but
right.
If both adulterous and homosexual behavior are sins, and if one cannot bless sin, then how can Leo argue that the doctrinal positions on these immoral and sinful acts can change if and when people's attitudes change? Such a position, reminiscent of what Lawrence Korbes said as he testified before Congress, makes me think that it is no different than Mr. Korb. So that's you can read the rest of the article in full. If you just type in the headline "Attitudes Cannot Change Doctrine," you'll find this former priest article. So, and again, I don't know very much about him except as able to discern from his writings. He's definitely not a traditionalist, and seems to be because he was, battering down the Lavender Palace gates, as it were, during the initial days of the sex abuse crisis breaking.
Mm-hmm.
He was removed, laicized. It's interesting too because we have McCarrick. What is the thing that McCarrick does to bring in accountability? Well, they put in rules which get approved in Rome that basically the bishop can laicize a priest for any reason without a trial. And there are priests now that they just get a thing in the mail. They're no longer a priest because the bishop held a whole trial without them and found reasons and asked for his laicization, and it got rubber stamped in Rome and came back, and he's no longer a priest. I mean, ministerially, he is now returned to the lay state. That's happened. There's actually a case that I'm trying to get more information about. But you remember there were some women that were suing the church, arguing in Peru, arguing that then Bishop Prevost did not do, even covered up for sexual abuse. And we don't know the truth of those allegations, whether that's the case. But these women were suing the church canonically. At a certain point, the canonical lawyer for them alleges that they received a large payment and they dropped the suit. He, because he represented them, was subsequently laicized in this manner. Just got a note in the mail. He's no longer a priest. No trial, no chance to defend himself. And like I said, I'm trying to get more information on that. I have the name, but I won't divulge it until I've had a chance to corroborate that. Maybe, he'd be a great guy to interview on these subjects. But
yeah, wow, that's fascinating. And I think something else I wanted to mention, since we've been talking about fiducia supplicans, just last week, Diane Montagna published on her blog, or her Substack, I guess, as I should say, is
that's the new word, the new verbiage.
International Catholic Coalition calls on Pope Leo XIV to revoke fiducia supplicans. And as I mentioned earlier, Pope Leo met this morning or sometime today in Rome with His Eminence Cardinal Robert Serra, who is also very outspoken against unnatural vice and the LGBT agenda. So hopefully he brought this up with the Pope as well. But I mean, honestly, I think this is a very noble effort and should be commended, but I don't think it's actually going to end up going anywhere, unfortunately. I mean, hopefully we're proven wrong and hopefully it does go somewhere, but I think the effort to get him to overturn fiducia supplicans, which he, again, as we mentioned, basically defends the legitimacy of it in this interview with Crux, I highly doubt that this effort is going to go anywhere. What do you think?
Yeah, I do not think that. I mean, let's put it this way: there's only one time since Vatican II that popes have been willing to undo what a previous pope had done, and that's with permissions for the traditional mass or anything traditional. That can all be undone. But anything advancing the revolution cannot be undone. So it's easy enough for Pope Francis to completely nuke some more pontificum and all the liberalizing legislation going back to John Paul II, in fact, on the traditional mass. It's perfectly, and to do so, or at least I should say, the document that Francis issued contains a manifest lie. Shamelessly. lies. I'm not going to say Francis himself explicitly lied, because I don't know if he wrote the document or it was written for him. But the document itself shamelessly lies and says that Pope Benedict only did this for the SSPX. Benedict himself told us when the document was issued, why it was being done. And it's completely in consonant with things that Pope Benedict had said before. That, well, if the church denies her own patrimony, how can we say to be, the church, the same church, right? If we say that what was absolutely the most sacred thing in the church is now completely forbidden, what does that say about us, right? He's made these statements in the past, and it all fits with his reasoning, which is pretty much the exact same reasoning when he writes to the bishops about Summorum Pontificum. And then you have in Jailers of the Tradition where it says that, it was only because of bringing the SSPX and that he allowed this. And so that hasn't come to fruition. So we're just going to get rid of it. And as well as all the reasons in the bishop's report, which again, we know is now based on some falsehood of some kind. And again, I want to stop short of saying Pope Francis lied in that, because I don't know if he himself wrote that or that was represented to him as the case or what have you, and he just signed the document. Said, all right, yeah, put it out. Unless I knew that detail, I wouldn't want to say something about the Holy Father like that. But it's it's really, telling that they can do that. But when it comes to anything that advances the revolution, it'll never happen. Fiducia supplicans will not be overturned. Highly unlikely that Jailers of the Tradition will be overturned until there's a full restoration of the church. However God's going to bring that about.
Yes. So just to wrap up this segment of our show, I mean, basically my two main takeaways from what he said on clergy sexual abuse. As I said, I think this is one of the main, if not the main, wounds in the church's, the mystical body of Christ, or human element, is this issue, and it should be front and center. It should be one of the center focuses of the church right now in cleaning up this mess and eradicating this plague. And number two, identifying the actual root cause of it. You can't eradicate a disease if you refuse to identify correctly the disease.
Mm-hmm.
And the disease is sodomy, plain and simple. So that's kind of where I think we'll leave it there for now. But
what do we want to do? I mean, we might as well go for broke.
Sorry, say that again.
Do we want to talk about China? I mean, it's been almost 2 hours. We might as well go for broke.
Oh, I think, yeah. I think we'll finish this segment here, and then we'll go ahead and move on to our last topic. Again, this is not exhaustive of the whole interview. I just tried to choose some, main topics of interest from the interview. If there are links to all the excerpts in the description to this video, if you're inclined to want to read all of those. We kind of did the heavy lifting for you and picked out some of the key quotes. So this will be our last one for today. This is one of the worst elements of the Francis legacy in many ways, which often gets overlooked among his other heresies and other bad things. But this is a major scandal and a major problem with his pontificate. Was the infamous Vatican China deal, which was first signed in October, as I recall, October of 2018, and it basically concerns gives permission essentially to the Chinese Communist Party to appoint bishops of the Catholic Church, which is unheard of, even for a Catholic government, even for Catholic rulers. They were never supposed to be involved in that. It's what was the Libertas Ecclesiae, something like the liberty of the church. One of the saints in the Middle Ages fought for this. I can't think of his name at the moment.
Well, you're thinking of St. Thomas of Canterbury?
Yeah, I think him. Yeah, or St. Thomas Becket, one of those.
Yeah, they're the same. Sorry.
Oh, they're the same. Okay.
Yeah. And that's the main thing with Becket is the liberty of the church. De facto, it does devolve into that in Europe, where you have, I mean, like in Henry VIII's time, for example, the English king for hundreds of years, Henry V especially, kind of made the church do whatever he wanted it to do. And the Pope would approve whoever was being made a bishop. Basically, if the king nominated him, it was done. There's not really a big investigation into whether this guy's worthy of being a bishop, whether he's the right candidate for bishop. The Pope's more or less rubber stamping whoever the kings are sending in. Yeah, we want this guy as a bishop. And oh, by the way, the first year's income of that diocese is coming to you in way of tax. You need that for your things, don't you? So it was an abuse. And it took the church a very long time to curb, and it's still going on. And then once it had largely been corrected, where rulers can't just appoint bishops anymore, well, Then you get the heresy Febronism, which says that the state is the guarantor of the rights. Right, before the French Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a popular doctrine. Joseph II of Austria is very much in favor of this doctrine. It's taught again at the Council of Pistoia, right? And so that the king and the monarch should be appointing the bishops, and he should control all the church's assets and such,
Mm-hmm.
and whatnot locally. Well, the French Revolution does that with the Constitution of the Clergy and Napoleonic law. Further, the government owns the churches, and the church administers them. That's still actually how it works in Europe today. So there is precedent for that, but not as something the church knows of, but as something the church had to deal with because of the political situation hundreds of years ago. So, right. Anyway, so that the church would willingly accept such a situation, that's actually what's really scandalous.
Absolutely. And moreover, accept it with one of the most evil regimes in modern history, if not the entire history of the world. Communism, one of the errors of Russia that Our Lady of Fatima warned us about, and in China, it's manifested itself in a horrible, brutal manner. Certainly on par with Soviet Russia. So here's what he had to say in regard to what he's going to do in regard to that policy. I would say that in the short term, I will continue the policy that the Holy See has followed for some years now, and it's been several predecessors, as if that means anything. I in no way pretend to be wiser or more experienced than all those who have come before me. Obviously, he's referring to, John the 23rd and forward. I don't think he's referring to
Well,
because if he actually meant what he said there, then he would be bringing back the traditional Latin Mass.
right.
Does he know better than Pope St. Pius V, for
Does he know
example?
better than St. John the 23rd, who celebrated that Mass his entire life?
Right. Right, exactly. He says, I'm also in ongoing dialogue, there's that word again, with a number of people. Maybe synodality can solve this problem. I think
Maybe. Seems to be the solution to everything else.
Yeah, dialogue with a number of people, Chinese, on both sides of some of the issues that are there. I'm trying to get a clearer understanding. Again, it seems like he wants to have it both ways on many issues. Like he doesn't want to offend anyone. He doesn't want to ostracize it. And you have to draw a line in the sand at some point. Our Lord says, either you're with me or against me. Either you gather to me or you scatter. Like choose a side. And I also think of the famous quote from Sister Lucia of Fatima in a 1957 interview with a priest. She said, Father, the time, I forget the exact quote, but the time has come to choose. Either we are for God or we are for the devil. There is no other possibility. It's one or the other. So choose a side. He's saying, I'm trying to get a clear understanding of how the church can continue the church's mission, respecting both culture and political issues that have obviously great importance, but also respecting a significant group of. So in other words, he's saying, how do I do this while respecting the evil communist regime in China, while also respecting faithful Catholics? He says, a significant group of Chinese Catholics who for many years have lived some kind of oppression or difficulty. I mean, again, the understatement there is kind of insulting, I would say. Like they've been horribly persecuted for their fidelity to Christ and his church, fidelity to Rome, which is what Pius XII, talking about his predecessors, made very clear in it's either the late 40s or early 50s in an encyclical. Like he sympathized greatly, deeply with their sufferings, but ultimately made it clear to them, you have to be ready to be martyrs here. You can't sacrifice. You can't go along with this communist regime and their Catholic Patriotic Association or whatever they call it. You have to be faithful to the Holy Mother Church and to Christ, or you're going to end up losing your souls, basically. But Leo seems to want to have it both ways. He doesn't want to step on anybody's toes.
In true liberal American fashion.
I don't understand his concern with offending communist leaders. I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me at all.
No, there's so many things about the Vatican China deal that have never made sense from the beginning. And of course, it's still ultra secret. We don't actually know all the terms and conditions of it. It's never been reported. Even Cardinal Zen, who's a prelate in that country and knows the ground, he was shut out of discussions on this document. It was people who know the situation in China that made it, based on geopolitical aims, probably input from Vatican. The Vatican has intelligence services and Western intelligence, and they network, and that seems to be what this agreement is meant to do, is to not create tension between China and the West, and at the same time resolve things that Rome will tolerate or allow. So, but even as recently as just now, Pope Leo. Let's see. I have this from the Pillar that I'm currently got. I could share it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, let me do that. Our frenemies at the Pillar generally do good reporting, but people involved we don't always agree with. But just beside that, Pope Leo approves reordering of Chinese dioceses, appoints new bishop. Pope Leo XIV has suppressed 2 dioceses in mainland China and erected a new diocese with a new bishop, the Vatican announced September 10th, a move suggesting a new level of cooperation between China and the Vatican on mainland church affairs. The announcement represents the first occasion under Pope Leo in which the territory of mainland Chinese dioceses has been altered to reflect civil jurisdictions, and one of the first times such alterations have received a papal approval since the 2018 provisional agreement between the Vatican and China on the appointment of bishops, signaling a possible renewed level of cooperation between Rome and Beijing. Several previous instances have seen Chinese state authorities attempt to invalidly create and suppress dioceses without papal involvement. The Vatican press office announced Wednesday that the Pope had, quote, decided to suppress the diocese of Zhonghua in Zhuangzi, I'm probably not saying them right, but trying, which had been erected in 1946, and at the same time to erect the new diocese of Saint-Jacques, suffragan of Beijing, in order to promote the pastoral care of the Lord's flock and attend more effectively to its spiritual good. Unmentioned in the official announcement is the future of the 2 bishops of the now suppressed dioceses, both of whom were members of the underground church in China and refused to join the Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association, the state-sponsored body which oversees sanctioned Catholic practices in the country. According to reports, Bishop Augustin Kuitai of Zhonghua, 75, who has been subject to several rounds of state sanction, including house arrest, is now identified as retired, while Bishop Joseph Ma Yinan of Zhuangzi has been appointed as auxiliary bishop of the new diocese of Zhangjiakou. So they go on, but apparently, the bishop who's now retired from one of these dioceses as well, he is in state custody, in state incarceration. And these dioceses, which again were served by the underground church, as it were, which gets almost no support from the Vatican today. They are in custody at the moment. So I could go on with this. It's interesting. This report goes on to show how after Pope Francis had died, the Chinese announced a new bishop for some of these dioceses that there's no pope in Rome to approve, which is even against the Vatican China deal. And so let's see. There's a bunch of different things. So what I can say in general on this subject is I know a couple of people, one who's completely fluent in Chinese and he's been to China several times, and he actually teaches, he's Catholic, he teaches, Chinese department at a university in this country. He's written several books. He's fairly knowledgeable about all this stuff. And one of the things he pointed out is that the origins of the Chinese Patriotic Association come from the beginnings of Chinese communism in the 30s. And it was in opposition to the Legion of Mary and in China. And so it was an attempt by the communists to, they had mistranslated some of the spiritual language around crusades, armies and whatnot, the rosary and such, and said that we need our own Catholic political movement to take these Catholics away from Chiang Kai-shek and get them in the communist fold. And that's the origins, really, of the Patriotic Association. Even before there was a Chinese communist government, there was a Chinese Catholic Patriot Association, because Catholicism in China was huge. I mean, it was because you look at the Chinese population, they have 1 billion more people than what live in the United States currently. And, the minority Catholics in China outnumber Catholic populations in many places in the world. So with these origins, the state absolutely felt the need to control the Catholic Church, and that's why they had set up the Patriotic Association. Now, interestingly, they all continued saying the traditional mass all through the 60s and 70s. And it wasn't until the late 80s that the Patriotic Association realized, oh, well, actually, the Vatican II kind of accords with our goals and our purpose. And so they created their own sort of Novus Ordo mass in Chinese, whereas the underground church, they'd never heard about Vatican II. They kept saying the traditional mass. I don't know if that state of affairs continues now. I actually should ask this. I don't want to name this individual without checking with him first. It's a doctor, well known in certain circles anyway, but just in case. There's in the Patriotic Association, there's a lot of people who are Catholic, and as far as they're concerned, they're doing their best to be Catholic and in union with the Pope and not the Patriotic Association. So there's a lot of people in the Patriotic Association churches that actually are not in their hearts part of the Patriotic Association. They're just trying to, deal with the powers that be or shouldn't be. And that's another interesting thing, is that what actually divides the Patriotic Association and the underground church is really just a little bit of, for many cases, not all, in many cases, actually just a formal bit of a state approval in different ways. The Vatican China deal, though, is actually allowing the Chinese to ferret a lot of those people out and put in people that are more according to the mind of the regime.
Right.
And Cardinal Zen has alleged that very thing, and he would certainly be more knowledgeable about all the specifics of that than I am, because I've never been to China and I don't speak Chinese. So, but just putting that out there, there is, this whole thing is really troubling. And, Pope Leo says, well, I don't know better than any of my predecessors. Oh, really? So you don't know any better than Pope Benedict the 16th on Summorum Pontificum either, I guess. But I guess he would counter, yeah, and I also don't know better than Francis, who decided to get rid of it. So again, it is a very distinct American type of liberalism. We don't want to offend anyone. We want to please everyone, because in Europe, liberals have no problem offending the other side. Latin America, liberals have no problem offending the other side. But in America, there's this, and it's older liberalism, because now you see the new left in America has absolutely no problem offending the other side, like all the ghouls that are celebrating Charlie Kirk's assassination and such things, that and calling for his kids to be killed too, or glad his kids are growing up without a father. All these absurd and disgusting statements. That's the new left, and they look very much like the left in other countries. The old kind of boomer older liberalism that we don't want to offend anyone. We want to that's going away, but that's the milieu that the way that the Holy Father speaks. It tells me that's kind of like his mindset.
And I'm glad you brought up Charlie Kirk, because of course they had a memorial service yesterday, which basically went on all day, and I didn't watch all of it, not even most of it, but I did watch Erica Kirk's speech, his widow, and she gave a phenomenal speech. I've posted it on my social media on X and Facebook. I highly encourage people to listen to it. It's a little under 30 minutes, but specifically about Charlie, there have been people saying, credible sources, that he was getting close to coming into the church. I certainly hope that was the case. Like, for example, this organization, Catholics for Catholics, posted something late last week. I guess that would have been Friday of last week, the 19th, that someone saying, U.S. bishop confirms rumors of Charlie Kirk converting to Catholicism. He told me, quote, "I'm this close." But something, I want to play this clip from Charlie from earlier this year. I think this was in January, when he was talking to Michael Knowles from the Daily Wire, who is Catholic,
right?
A traditional Latin Mass Catholic. And listen to what he said as one of his primary stumbling blocks for entering the church. Let me put this in here. All right, here we go.
I believe that there are personally some fundamental issues with, like I say, Mariology, transubstantiation, which we're not going to get into. But the biggest one is the papacy. I can't get over the idea of this Marxist who calls himself the head of your church being a representation of Christ our Lord.
So obviously he's talking about Pope Francis, and he's rightfully called the dictator Pope. He was clearly a liberation theology fan, Marxist minded. I mean, he one time even told that Eugenio Scalfari guy that if Christians are the real, or what did he say? Communists are the true Christians, something to that effect.
Right.
So here's what Charlie says.
I mean that as someone who loves the Catholic impact on the world, that says it openly, and by the fruit you will know it, and you have very Marxist fruit.
But what?
I have to agree. I mean,
Yeah,
what can you say? What can you say?
Italians did the same thing. I think it was a multiple Italian carnival floats from when they celebrated Carnival, which would depict. There is one that has Francis dressed up like Che Guevara. It would say Che Papa. There was another one, Papa Comunista, Papa Comunisto. There was another one I saw from Verona that had the Pope dressed up like a Chinese communist after the China deal. And it was Italians felt very strongly that that Francis was actually a Marxist. Whether he was a full card-carrying Marxist, I don't know, but he definitely gave that appearance. And so I wanted to just be careful because I like to speak cautiously when just respecting the office of the papacy, but he definitely gave that appearance. So I can't blame Charlie Kirk for looking at it and just saying, hey, call a spade here. Your guy is a Marxist. I don't blame him. And it's interesting how that, because the Pope embraced an ideology, became polarizing, that even against Catholic teaching, which condemns communism and socialism. Again, it's, I mean, you go to Leo the 13th, go to Pius XI. It's, in Pius XII, it's very clear that the church has condemned communism and such.
And socialism.
Yeah. And even the socialists, even the condemnation of the Nazi party, Mitbrennan and Zorga mentions the socialist principles of the Nazi party. So there's, so much there that, you look at, a Pope, even if he has various opinions, he needs to be neutral. He needs to be the vicar of Christ, irrespective of he agrees with this or agrees with that. We've had bad popes in the tradition, bad popes in the past and whatnot. But, this is a way in which Pope Francis embraced ideology and caused polarization, to use Pope Leo's words. And in that scandalized somebody if it wasn't an issue for him, the rest probably would have fallen in. I've known it a lot of times with Protestants, if the papacy falls into line and they can see that, the other issues usually don't hang them up very much. So C.S. Lewis actually put this in his letters with a Catholic priest. It's called the Latin Letters of C.S. Lewis. There was a Catholic priest that read Screwtape Letters and said, wow, we need to talk to this Lewis guy because he could be a great force for good in the world. And so he started writing him to dialogue with him to get him to convert to the Catholic Church. And he wrote him in Latin because he didn't know English. And Lewis appreciated the letter, got out his Latin dictionaries, and composed a letter right back in Latin. And there was a whole series of letters traded between Lewis and this priest. You can read it, and there's a translation provided in it, the Latin Letters of C.S. Lewis. And one of the things that Lewis says I think it's the second letter to this priest, where he says, I've read Moore's Dialogue on Heretics, and I've read Tyndale's replies, and they're both obviously men who are motivated by faith, and it's hard for me to tell the truth between all of them, but really the crux of the matter comes down to the papacy. And if I could believe the papacy, I could believe anything. And that's I can believe that he specifically in context, he means anything in Catholicism. So that's a lot of times that's the rub. Actually, that's the issue. Even way back when the English hierarchy under Charles I was concerned by the numbers of aristocracy that were converting to Catholicism by the influence of his French queen, Henrietta Marie, they set up a debate between Archbishop Laud and who's very high church, Archbishop Laud, by the way. His response to Catholic conversions is to show that Protestantism can have the beauty of holiness too. So he re-erects altars where they'd been torn down in English churches. He re-erects even the rood screen, tries to make the liturgy more solemn, and forces it in churches that are definitely more Puritan by disposition, which leads to some of the religious conflicts that will come about in the English Civil War. But he has a debate with a Jesuit that they had in prison, whose name is Fisher, no relation to St. John Fisher. But he and the entire debate surrounded Bellarmine and mostly surrounded the papacy. And at a certain point, he had this Jesuit had some arguments that Laud couldn't answer, and he basically circled back to some things in Bellarmine. He said, "Look, it's just simple. If I believed the papacy, I would be Catholic without further ado. But I shall not do that until I dote. God help me." And but if Laud had believed the papacy, the rest, even though he's a staunch Protestant, the rest would have fallen into place for him. So that really is the crux. I mean, people might get hung up on this and that, but if the papacy makes sense, then the rest of it will make sense.
Right. I think
And that's the scandal of popes not behaving like popes or causing scandal.
And I think the great, maybe to kind of encapsulate this, the grave scandal that Francis caused, and I think Leo is going to continue causing if he goes along with the Vatican China deal. There are Protestants who, I know Chris Ferrara has mentioned this in talks before, that he has Protestant friends who take the social kingship of Christ a lot more seriously than a lot of Catholics he knows. And I think it's safe to say that Charlie Kirk, in his own, less than full understanding of the faith, he took the social kingship of Christ as he understood it very seriously. That was at the heart of his political activism, was bringing souls to Christ in the only way that he knew how to do that as a non-Catholic. So to see a pope, entering into an agreement with an evil regime, condemned by the Catholic Church, a communist regime, that's got to be a horrible stumbling block. And even for those of us in the church, obviously it's a cause of grave scandal. How can this be? So just to circle back to to Pope Leo's statements, I think this really sums it up to me. I'm trying to get a clearer understanding without choosing sides, but that's the whole problem. You have to choose a side, and the side you should be choosing are the faithful Catholics in China, not the Chinese Communist Party. That's the long and short of it.
Yeah, even if you can't help them directly, materially, Pius XII wasn't able to give that much material support to the church in China, but he definitely gave them moral support and preached on the horrors that Chinese communism inflicting on the church. And you are more likely to get the Pope today to talk about offenses that the Chinese commit against the Tibetan Buddhists than you are against the underground church in China.
Right.
Which is really that's where we're at.
Before we conclude, and I thank everybody again for staying with us. I know this we've kind of a marathon discussion, but there was a lot to cover. This was a very sprawling interview, and we wanted to give you a full picture of it as best we could. So that's kind of the end of our coverage of the interview. But last week, in addition to these excerpts of the Crux interview being published, we also were faced with this news that Pope Leo, not surprisingly, had sent a message to. So every few years, there's some sort of an international, what do they call it? International Congress, interreligious meeting, basically in Kazakhstan, actually where Bishop Schneider is an auxiliary bishop in Astana. And Pope Francis participated in it the last session, and I think I was back in 2022, and reiterated his heretical claims, basically about that God wills the diversity and plurality of religions, all that garbage. So let me explain this graphic here. So we have Pope Leo, apparently some pilgrims from Kazakhstan who were going to participate in this Congress, which took place last week in Kazakhstan. Earlier in September, went to Rome as part of the Jubilee year. He welcomed them. And then just last week, let me see if I can share this on my screen. Well, hang on let me take this down real quick, and then I'll share this statement. So let me see here. Here we go. So this is from last week. I think it was published Sunday the 14th, now that I think about it. And this was his message to those who were going to be participating in the Congress. Yeah, message of the Holy Father to participants in the 8th Congress of the Leaders of World and Traditional Religions, which took place last, Wednesday and Thursday, I guess, 17th and 18th. And he talks about, I guess the theme of this meeting was Dialogue of Religions, Synergy for the Future. And, he lauds the example of John Paul II, for example. He mentions Nostra Aetate, of course, which is like the charter for all of this interreligious nonsense since Vatican II. Then he goes on to actually praise these two events that took place in that I have on this other one. So let me put up this other slide. So here in 1986, we have the infamous interreligious prayer meeting in Assisi. under John Paul II, and it was repeated by him again later in his pontificate, and then a third time by Benedict XVI. And then here, of course, we have Francis in 2019 signing the infamous Abu Dhabi Declaration document on human fraternity that I've mentioned a couple of times, the one that claims that God wills the diversity, plurality of religions. And this is what Pope Francis, or Pope Leo rather, had to say about these two things. So he says, in this endeavor, synergy for the future is not an abstract slogan, but a living reality that has already borne fruit, he claims. What kind of fruit? There's good fruit and bad fruit. Just because it's borne fruit doesn't mean it's good. So he says the historic gathering of religious leaders for prayer in Assisi in 1986, which, by the way, included the placing of a Buddhist, like a Buddha statue on top of a tabernacle in a Catholic church, under the supervision of Catholic clergy, convened by Pope John Paul II, demonstrated that there can be no peace among nations without peace among religions. So again, it's this idea that world peace is going to be achieved by human fraternity rather than a gift of God, and conforming ourselves to him, to his divine revelation, to Christ the King, the Prince of Peace. It's a trying to provide a natural solution to this problem when only the supernatural solution will ever work. Christ gives us peace, not the world. So what does he go on to say here? More recently, the document on human fraternity, signed in Abu Dhabi in 2019 by my venerable predecessor, Pope Francis, and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, offered a clear blueprint for how religious synergy can advance global peace and coexistence. This is an endorsement of that heretical text. We witnessed this.
He's
Go ahead.
Doing exactly what he said he was going to do. He's continuing Pope Francis's legacy.
Right. So he says, we witnessed this same spirit at the last meeting of this Congress in 2022, where leaders of diverse faiths, and that's a misnomer as well, because as Bishop Schneider explains in Christus Vincit, his book-length interview with Diane Montagna, only the Catholic religion can claim the title of faith as an act of the intellect conforming to the truths divinely revealed by God on God's authority. False religions can't claim to be a faith, not in the true sense of the word.
Right.
He says, so in 2022, diverse leaders, including Pope Francis, came together to condemn violence and extremism, advocate for the care of refugees, and call upon all leaders to work jointly for peace. But they're excluding the author of peace, Christ our Lord, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, all of this to me points to the fact, I think, as we're wrapping up, like, what are we to make? How do we answer the question, quo vadis Leo? Leo, where are you going? I think it's pretty obvious where he's going. He's going exactly as he said. He's sticking to the path of complete commitment to the post-conciliar path, which is destroying the church, and specifically to Francis's interpretation of what that path should look like. So that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah, there's so much to say. In the first place, can you have, so let's just take the idea that, there are elements of truth in false religions, but those, because there's certain elements of religion that's grasped by natural law. There's certain things of like original truth that stood up for the first revelation in the patriarchal period prior to the flood. There's, that have, communicated along. There's definitely, truth in other religions at certain points, but that does not make those religions true. And we could even go further where you have certain statements that those elements of truths in false religions can be specific for them. Understood properly according to the theologians teach, because the Catholic Church is necessary for salvation. Membership in the church is necessary in salvation, but there's also ways in which people can be saved by participating in that. But it has to be, as far as like the Thomistic responses, active faith, actual faith, which is going to come through by some means of God. And those elements in those false religions that are true can be the means by which somebody grasps the truth, which would have to be some kind of knowledge of the Trinity or Christ infused in the person, which, through some means known to God alone, purely ex opere operantis, that is by the work of the worker, not ex opere operato, it's not infallible. It does not mean those means of truth are salvific ex opere operato. It doesn't mean those religions are salvific and you're not saved by those religions, but rather that the truth in those religions, they're limited as they are, depending which one you're talking about, could become by some action of God, unknown to us, which we will never know in this life, salvific for people in that. And that's really all that those kind of statements mean in their proper signification. Doesn't mean it is, or those religions are good, those religions are salvific. And that's the thing. So we're way far beyond even those kind of statements. In this and talking about, synergy, like here's another new buzzword, synergy for the future. Good heavens. But anyway, synergy becomes a powerful sign of hope for all humanity, revealing that religion at its core is not a source of conflict, but a wellspring of healing and reconciliation. It's like a liberal word soup that doesn't actually mean anything. Mm-hmm. And again, whether the Holy Father wrote this or was written for him, I don't know. It seems to me like he's writing it himself. But this whole of we just got to get together and express solidarity. We all believe something, isn't that great? And we're all going to walk away better from it. And it's like, none of this helps humanity. None of this helps anything. Jesus Christ saves humanity through his church. That is the synergy of the future, is right. The same synergy of the past. Yep. The church established by Jesus Christ for the mission of salvation in the world. So these kind of statements that what is anyone in these false religions going to conclude from statements like this coming from the Catholic Pope? Oh, my religion's just good. Oh, I'll keep persevering in my religion. That's what they will walk away from. That's what's particularly, the error with these things. And I just don't see how, there could be any way forward with this type of thing, except again, to basically cause indifferentism. One religion's good. Far from erasing, this is from the statement of Pope Leo, far from erasing differences, cooperation among religions invites the faithful to embrace diversity as a source of enrichment. And again, and this is just like the buzzwords.
Sounds like DEI statement or something. It's
exactly. And I'll call this back to when I used to be a salaried manager at a retail outfit, and we had this thing from corporate about diversity. And my store manager looked at me and he said, "Well, Ryan, assistant manager Ryan, what do you think about diversity?" And I'm like, "Well, diversity of people who can carry out the tasks that will have us in the black is great. But diversity of people just for some kind of outside characteristic that has nothing to do with the job means absolutely nothing. At the end of the day, our bonuses are going to go down if we're in the red, if we don't control our shrink, if we don't work more efficiently, if we don't take care of our people, we're going to have more turnover." That's the diversity of people who could do that. And he's like, exactly right. So what am I supposed to do with this thing from corporate now? I'm like, tell them you get the most diverse people who can do the job in the most diverse ways. Some little newspeak going back the other way. But it's like, and that's really what it is. You talk about diversity by these accidental characteristics. It doesn't actually mean anything. Now, if we're talking about within the church, there's always a diversity of spiritualities, devotions. There's a diversity of even, liturgical rites between East and West, even in the West, until Vatican II kind of really honestly, not so much Trent, Pius V and the Congregation of Rites they took the wrong idea from Pius V, and they work really hard at Romanizing the Western rites, which I think is actually something that was not terribly good. But those rites continue to exist, and there were various cardinals intervened. No, let their rights stay intact. Let's just fix this and this, with their input on ways to, and then that was kind of solved. You see Bellarmine doing a bit of that when he's in the Congregation of Rites, trying to preserve the liturgies of Western rites. But the Vatican II steamrolls the liturgies of the religious orders and other liturgies that have been used in the West. So that's where you have diversity of authentic liturgical expression that have come from tradition. And you see the same thing in the East with different liturgies of different churches, of different Eastern churches that are Catholic. And people have devotion to different saints. There, in people from all nations in Christ, there's neither Jew nor Greek. But yet, they are worshiping Christ as one in the one true church, which is already one, which is not divided. Right. And obviously, in terms of ecclesiology, the church is not divided. In terms of practically, we talk about that in a colloquial sense. The church is divided by this. People have different views and such, and that's a different signification. So this is like diversity for diversity's sake. It's like you said, it's just like DEI. We have extra points for the more diversity we got. Hey, it's not enough to be Black anymore. You also have to be Black and gay and handicapped, or Black and gay and trans. And then that your diversity goes up and you'll get more roles. Our film is more diverse now because we threw all these people out there. Yep. We can't get your documentary on the Battle of Hastings reproduced unless you have some, enough racial diversity. It's about England and Vikings and Normans. There might have been some stray Moor or something like that as mercenary, maybe, but we don't have any evidence of that. Oh no, well, you got to have it. So then you got half the army is Black now. You're production with a Black Anne Boleyn. This one, period dramas are suffering so horribly with that because again, the Bechdel test. You got to have a certain quota of diversity in order to get your film made. Right. And it's the same thing. You got to have a certain quota of diversity on your board, whether they can do the job or not. Like that chick that they have running Cracker Barrel, which is absolutely rotten, horrible food, by the way. I don't know why anyone cares that much about it. But comes the idea that, we got to we need diversity, and we need to take away actual diversity and make our fast food restaurant like everything else. Mm-hmm. And what is diversity here? Make the church like everybody else, just some religion, some way people want to follow. Not, as our Lord said, the way, the truth, and the life.
Yes.
And
which is ultimately the root problem of the whole conciliar and post-conciliar period, is this idea of rapprochement or approaching the world with a completely different attitude, talking about changing attitudes, instead of understanding that the world, not human beings, but the spirit of the world, which is ultimately the spirit of the devil, is an enemy. Like we are, as St. James sums it up in his epistle in the New Testament, asking the rhetorical question, do you not know, basically saying, you fools, do you not understand that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Mm-hmm. Like, we can't be friends with the world and a friend of God at the same time. It's one or the other. Mm-hmm. So I think the last thing I wanted to touch on before we wrap up is, what is the proper response? So now we've covered all of this very concerning material from Pope Leo, which basically he seems to be a Francis II of sorts, if I can say that. Mm-hmm. What do we do with this? Because there seems to be a surge in certain corners among certain trads, some of whom we know and consider friends, like mm-hmm. Stephen Cox, for example, or Chris Jackson, or whoever else, who are they're the one we mentioned earlier in the show, this notion of Trad Inc., and they're kind of on a crusade against Trad Inc. right now. And especially with Stephen, again, I'm on friendly terms with him. He and I have known each other for years. I know the same is true for you. But he seems to be using this as a means of legitimizing sedevacantism as the real solution to the problem. That's kind of seems to be my take on it anyway. Yeah, which is not a good
moment. I mean, let's be honest. This is their moment. I mean, when you have as the rebellion against Christ and His church get more and more clear, this is definitely their moment to make that argument. And I have a harder time looking at them saying, "Hey, you're absolutely wrong about this." I get it. I don't agree with it, but I get it. And I think, they are kind of ratcheting up the language, and I guess now is the time to seize the moment, really, to get more people aware of it. But in the case like the new thing on the Trad Inc. for this and that and the other thing, there's one, and I like Stephen, by the way. We had him on the rundown not too long ago when the stuff at LifeSite News blew up.
Right.
You go in his thing too, or talk to him or whatever, if he ever wants me. But it seems the way in which they're going about the Trad Inc. stuff, I'm sure it's true that there are some people that think we should all be shutting up and getting the best deal we can from Leo or whatever. But like it's not like I don't have any notes from either Dr. Kwasniewski or Cardinal Burke or anybody else, Taylor Marshall, telling me, hey, you can't criticize Leo right now. We all got to be on the same page. I haven't gotten that memo. I don't know. Obviously, if we did, we're not paying attention to it.
Right.
But but the other thing, there's just an element of it that has it just has the vibe of the thing with certain YouTube, my channel's under attack type of videos to garner up attention and support. And I mean, hey, what else are you going to do in a media thing to get attention onto your new venture? So I get it again, but I don't think it's really there, except for a couple. Obviously, of Cardinal Burke calling for people to, be nice to Pope Leo. That way we'll get better. And he's got my name, didn't you know? He took it from me. He's listening to me. Calm down, Treads. It's going to be. We'll work it out. But will you? And I don't think that makes the basis for a Trad Inc. thing. It's like there's all sorts of conferences by the people. Somehow I got lumped in. There was one article. Actually, Chris Jackson shared the article. I don't know anything about Chris Jackson. I've never talked to him. I saw him on a podcast of some. Seems like a guy I'd have a great conversation with. I don't know. But he shared an article where I was lumped in with Dr. K and like all the evangelical press people on the question of like certain Hermeticism and certain occult things. And it was entirely a guilt by association by the mere fact that I defended Charles Coulomb because I felt he was getting a short shrift. And I did not defend Charles Coulomb being present at a tarot reading thing. I did not defend that. And I said he was wrong. And he apologized for that. Now, my only point was just because Coulomb, he's one of these guys, this rich literary background, a lot of human experience, also with actual occultists. And I was just merely defending that he was not an occultist. And he has, certain positions that I don't agree with, but they're permissible. Other ones, well, not so sure. But, but he's someone that himself is Catholic. He also likes sarcasm and making statements which were being taken out of the context of him making jokes, because he's just a joyful person, likes making a lot of jokes about things. And so, so I did my best to defend him because he's been personally kind to me. He's given me interviews that hours worth that I've never met him in person, but he could be spending his time promoting his work and doing more important things. He'd sit down for a no-name blog with very little reach just because he liked talking about these things. Right. So and whatnot. So, I just felt it was on my need to defend him. On the other hand, it's like, the article paints me as part of this big, magisterium of Trad Inc. working to put out Hermeticism. Like, all right, for one, I know a lot more about Hermesis Trismegistus and the whole tradition of Hermeticism as it comes into the Renaissance than any of these people did, number one. Number two, I haven't read the works by these various authors that they're complaining about, so they might be right, they may not be. I can't examine it in context, but I saw like in that same article, the mere fact that one of these authors dared to defend himself showed he was guilty. I'm like, what kind of reasoning is this? This is kind of ludicrous. And then that's again why I say, hey, if I get my checks from Trad Inc., damn, they are in arrears because I just flushed $3,000 down for plumbing. I'm sorely in need of some filthy lucre here. It's like I don't go to their conferences. I'm not on all their platforms, which is fine. Honestly, I don't care. I get on and I say what I think I got to say, and I do certain things, but because I think it's true or right, not because anyone's telling me to or paying me to. And hence, like we're on here being very critical of Leo because I think it's true. And and I'm not a sedevacantist because I don't think that's the correct response. If I did, I don't care what kind of market share I'd lose and things, how many people would not buy the books from my press or how many things I'd be disinvited from. If I thought it was true, I'd embrace it like that. About it, and there's just things that even though I can't answer all their arguments, there's things that it just doesn't work for me. The biggest thing being, and I said this with an interview with Father Rippegren, actually, it's going to go up in a few days, but it hasn't gone up yet. With 70 years with no Pope, and there's going to be, as things continue, it's going to go to 100, probably. And so according to the sedevacantist argument, irrespective of whether it's Cassiacum thesis or totalist or whatever, they're saying there hasn't been a Pope since 1958. Okay. So, and they base them like on some quote from the patristic scholar Jurgens commenting on the Western Schism, saying the church could have gone indefinitely in this situation. One, I don't think that's exactly true, but two, he's talking about a situation where there actually are acknowledged popes, and the world itself follows one or the other. There is someone legitimately doing stuff. It's just it wasn't certain anymore which one it was. And so, and then that was eventually solved by the church. But this was important enough that all the minds of Christendom were trying to solve how to reconcile the schism of two popes, both claiming to be pope, and half the Christian world supporting one or the other. And the solution was conciliarism, later condemned, but they because they were legitimately trying to come up with a way, and so they thought they had the right way. Both popes can refuse to resign, so they elected him. And then he had a successor. I can't remember his name, but then his successor, Baldassare Cossa, became John the 23rd. And interestingly, there's a lot of thinkers in the church that seem to refer to the Pisan popes as if they were true popes. And it's kind of interesting that way. But beside that, that's a side comment on the Western Schism we'll get to. But everyone was determined they had to solve this problem. No one was content to say, we'll work itself out. Because it's necessary for there to be a pope by the church's divine constitution and to know whom he is, or who he is. Right. It's that simple. And so something else that's on to 100 years with what is the last point. We're going to go on to 100 years or so with who knows how long Leo lives, but and then they'll be elect another one, probably in the same thing, and then they'll continue to he's not a real pope because he accepts Vatican II or whatever. At that point, he's not a real bishop, right? With the 68 ordination right argument and such. So then we come to this thing. Okay, so now we're at 100 years, and there has been no pope, but yet you say the church is still visible, the church is still there in sedevacanist chapels or independent chapels that have valid orders and profess right faith. We won't worry about the ones that fight against, we can't go to those sedevacanist chapels because they'll give communion to people who go to unicum masses, right? So they're not the right type of sedevacantists. And you can't go there because they're Feniites, or conversely. We're the only true sedevacantists because everyone else doesn't believe Feniism or what have you. You get that type of thing. Oh, we're the real church, but the church is still functioning and living right now. If that is so, then I argue the church doesn't need a pope. What's the point? What's the use? If the church can continue her mission without a pope for 100 years, you don't need a pope. That would be the consequence. And that's why at the end, even where there's arguments, and there's some arguments they have that are really good, I come down to that's the consequence. Granted, it's an argument from the facts, but that's where I stop. If these guys are not, if we're going that long, you just don't need one. And that's contrary to the divine constitution of the church. So obviously I can't accept that view. They wouldn't accept that view, obviously. Yeah, I don't want to strawman them. They don't believe the church doesn't need a pope. But I still think that's the consequence of their position. So, right.
And for me, it really,
if I thought they were right, I'd be right there with them if I thought they were right.
For me, it boils down to primarily the issue of the visibility of the church, which is one of the church's attributes, as opposed to her marks. She has 4 marks and 3 attributes. And if they, and especially considering the sedevacantists basically say if a pope says it, you have to accept it, regardless of theological note or whatever. You can't have any kind of reservations. If he said it, it's gospel truth, and that's it. And so, if by their own standard, then do they accept what Pius XII taught in Mystici Corporis regarding the origin of episcopal jurisdiction? Because Pius XII taught in Mystici Corporis Christi, paragraph number 42, he says that while bishops are true shepherds and rulers in their respective dioceses, they, quote, are subordinate to the lawful authority of the Roman pontiff, although enjoying the ordinary power of jurisdiction, which they receive directly from the same supreme pontiff. They don't, according to Pius XII, in an encyclical, magisterial teaching, bishops do not receive their jurisdiction directly from God, but only indirectly through the mediation of the Pope. If we have not had a Pope since 1958, Pius XII, there are no bishops left on earth with ordinary jurisdiction, which is a constituent part of the church that Christ founded. For example, and I've mentioned this in articles, responding to this notion that the church could survive a decades-long period of sedevacante, which is simply not true. If you accept the teaching of Pius XII, that is not true.
I
Because
will
according,
say
go
that
ahead.
the adherents of the Cassiacum thesis, they have an argument. I don't know if I want to give it because I'm going to butcher it, and I don't want to be seen to be strawmanning them. But
Right.
they have an argument because it comes from their distinctions that they make that really the ordinary jurisdiction still flows from the man who's been elected, but he hasn't formally come pope because he's being held up by not being a member of the church. And so there's arguments against that. I think that's correct, but again, I do not want to strawman the thesis adherents. So I might have gotten it wrong. And that's, but anyway, so the result of their argument is they try to get around the ordinary jurisdiction by arguing it's still flowing from the church rather than a situation of necessity knows no law. So it's all supplied and so on and so
Yeah,
forth.
but the
Out there.
problem with that, I would say, is that they're doing exactly what they say we do is illegitimate. They're recognizing a pope but resisting his teaching, because if they claim that you have to accept absolutely everything a pope says as infallible, regardless of if if the charism of infallibility has been engaged or not, then they have to accept what Pius XII taught, that jurisdiction doesn't come directly from God; it comes from a true pope. And for example, Father E. Sylvester Berry, a famous theologian, wrote a great book on. Let me remind myself of the title of that. Let's see here. Father Berry wrote, I think it was a book on ecclesiology, the Church of Christ. I'm just trying to find the title here real quick. Actually, I have it on my shelf. Yeah, that is the title of it. Here we go. The Church of Christ, an apologetic and dogmatic treatise. And he explains in that book, let me read this quote that I have in one of my articles. When we say that the Church of Christ is visible, we primarily mean that it is a society of men with external rites and ceremonies and all the external machinery of government, which would obviously have to include bishops with ordinary jurisdiction to teach and rule the flock, by which it can be easily recognized as a true society. And as I explained in the article, Barry says in his book, apostolic succession depends not only on valid episcopal consecration, but also on the transmission of legitimate authority to govern, which Father Barry calls formal succession, not simply material succession.
Mm-hmm.
And according to Pius XII, again, that requires a true pope. So sedevacantism is simply a dead end. I mean, I think the best way to sum it up, as some priests from the Society of St. Pius X did many years ago, like 20 some years ago, it's a false solution to a real problem. I think
Let me
that's
pose to you an objection that they pose. So, well, this is one. Which is more believable, that the church could go on without a pope, or that the pope could teach error? And they would then go on to argue that the pope in no way can teach error, even if the charism infallibility is not there, that he won't be allowed to err in his teaching office, and then anything from the church, because you have to give an assent to the mind and will to it,
right.
can't lead you into error. And so, what would you say to that?
I think exactly what I've said in an article, my latest article actually, for 1 Peter 5. Well, I published it earlier this year, but ultimately I go back to what Bellarmine. I'm got your book right here,
Mm-hmm.
Mediatrix Press on the Roman Pontiff. So sedevacantists seem to hold, as far as I can tell, they hold the minority opinion of Albert Pigius,
Yeah.
that it's impossible for a pope to ever fall into heresy under any circumstance. And as Bellarmine notes, he says such an opinion is probable, according to him, and can easily be defended. Still, he says, because it is not certain and the common opinion is to the contrary, it will be worthwhile to see what the response should be if the Pope could be a heretic. And that was the whole premise for him going through. That's the first opinion of the 5 in what was it, book 2, chapter 30 of De Romano Pontifice, and then he goes on to outline the other opinions. But the problem is that the sedevacantists basically dogmatize the opinion of Pigius and make it sound like that is the teaching, that is Catholic teaching, which is simply not the case.
Right.
And Vatican I specifically actually eschewed that notion in Vatican I in the proceedings leading up to the formal definition of papal infallibility, which I also mentioned in an article. So that would be my response to that.
Mm-hmm.
And also, you know, as we both know, sedevacantists seem very they seem to like to invoke St. Robert Bellarmine because he talks about, you know, in the fifth true opinion is that what does it say? A manifest
heretic, you know,
here we
soon as
go. A
he,
pope who is a manifest heretic ceases in himself to be pope and head, just as he ceases in himself to be a Christian and a member of the body of the church. And they think that's like the silver bullet, though that proves that sedevacantism is not only possible but is true. They totally disregard what he says in regard to the fourth opinion of Cajetan, that censures or warnings, public warnings with the authority of the church are necessary according to divine law, namely Titus chapter 3,
mm-hmm.
where St. Paul says, you know, after the first and second warning or admonition, then you shun a heretic, but not before that. And then also, I think, you know, the sedevacantists who love to quote from De Romana Pontifice really need to read this translation that you did,
Mm-hmm.
specifically from Bellarmine's work on councils, from, you know, on the church militant. Well, this one includes on councils, on the church militant, on the marks of the church.
Yeah.
So this is in book 1 on councils. He says the fourth reason to call an ecumenical council is suspicion of heresy in the Roman pontiff, if perhaps it might happen, or if he were an incorrigible tyrant.
Mm-hmm.
For then a general council ought to be gathered, either to, Bellarmine says, to depose the Pope. Oh, so it doesn't happen automatically without the involvement of the
Well, let's say
hierarchy.
it this. So this is the important thing to understand with Bellarmine's thought. In Roman Pontiff, Book 2, Chapter 30, he's speaking ex parte papae, on the side of the Pope. In this book, he's speaking ex parte ecclesiae, on the side of the church. So on the side of the Pope, yes, he does in fact cease, according to Bellarmine, cease to be a member of the church as soon as he commits a manifest heresy. And that was the Renaissance theological term for what today we would call a formal heresy. He knows a doctrine that is de fide.
That he's pertinacious, basically.
And he's pertinaciously denies it. He knows the church teaches, once to give an obvious example, Trinity, right? Or something like that, you know, that Christ is two natures, but one divine person. And something like, and he says, well, you know, I don't actually like Miaphysitism. I'm going to go to that. And even though, yeah, I know Chalcedon, but we have a new understanding now. That would be manifest heresy, according to what Bellarmine says, right? Something like that. So Bellarmine's argument is that he does cease to be the Pope from the minute that happens. And so when he's condemning Cajetan's opinion, Cajetan said, in the whole Dominican tradition, by the way, all the way through Garrigou Lagrange, they say, no, the Pope continues to be, and that's the Thomist response, really. The Pope continues to be Pope and head until the council gives a declaratory sentence. But then Bellarmine, you know, Bellarmine's response to Cajetan is that, well, the council is still judging a Pope, you see. The only reason the council can give a declaratory sentence against the Pope is because he's not Pope. So the inferior is not judging the superior. And that's how, you know, you avoid conciliarism. But the reason Bellarmine says this is that the council is still necessary, right? And because he does not envisage...
Someone has to have the authority to establish pertinacity. It can't just be the private person in the pew. That's...
And so, I mean, the whole notion with manifest is that the pertinacity is demonstrated. That's part of the problem. But even there, like for deposition, that the pertinacity has got to be demonstrated, so that basically the whole point of the council is it's all covered. This guy is absolutely not the Pope. And by divine law, by God himself, he deposed himself and became a heretic. So now we will go on to elect a new Pope. So that way there's no doubt. And Suarez, he's actually unpacked. Some people think he's opposing Bellarmine, but he's actually developing this, because Suarez also speaking on the side of the church, is that it's not enough for it to be ipso facto, because what happens if he stays in office and continues publishing degrees? Are we to know he's the Pope or not? And that's why Suarez, really taking Bellarmine's thought, we need a council to solve all those matters. That way people know who is the Pope, because again, it's part of the divine constitution of the church that there is a Pope. And that's right. So, and that's why we have to know who he is and clarify for all the faithful. So, because otherwise you end up in this type of situation, or you see this again in the 14th and 15th century with the Fraticelli, right? These radical Franciscans that are so radically attached to poverty, they're absolutely resisting Pope John the 22nd's attempt to reform the Franciscan order. And they might have been right on some of their points anyway. But so John the 22nd issues a solemn judgment that Christ and the apostles had use of some property. But the Fraticelli go bananas. They declare he has opposed himself. He is no longer a member of the church and therefore no longer Pope. Any bishop or prelate in communion with him is excommunicated de facto, and you can only be in the Catholic Church if you go to our Fraticelli chapels spread out through Italy and Savoy. That's
sounds familiar.
Yeah, sounds familiar. You know, we've been here before. And
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I was just going to say the other quote that I like to turn to from Bellarmine, his treatise on councils. So the first quote I read was from chapter 9, but there's also a very significant couple statements in chapter 21 where he's talking about the Roman pontiff cannot be deprived of his right to summon councils and preside over them, unless, Bellarmine says, he were first convicted by the legitimate judgment of a council and is not the supreme pontiff. So that's more than simply saying, well, he's automatically fallen and we're just recognizing that fact. No, the council is engaged in an act of judgment here. And
Right.
at least in establishing the legal fact that he is a pertinacious heretic. And later on in the same chapter, the next page, it says, the Pope in a council is not the only judge, but has many colleagues, that is, all the bishops, who, if they could convict him of heresy, they could also judge and depose him, even against his will.
Because he's not actually Pope is the thing. And that's why that his necessary distinction in the fifth opinion, he's not actually the Pope. That's why they can convict him and get rid of him. But they're making it clear in that formal process. Is now it just demonstrates further what I was saying there in that distinction from the Dominican opinion, that formal process is taking place because he ceased to be Pope the moment he became pertinacious heretic. Now this demonstrates it on the church's side, all legal and good, and the reason it has to be that he's not the Pope from the moment he becomes a pertinacious heretic is he gives other acts, he does other things, he makes other appointments. And it has to be clear he was not the Pope
to everybody. It has to be a publicly established, like a canonically established fact. It can't just be somebody's private opinion.
Right. And so now they'll say on the other side, well, it's not just private opinion. We're just recognizing reality. You know, he's obviously a heretic, they'll say, and therefore he's not a member of the church. And so what would you say to that? We're just recognizing reality. We're not,
Well, I would say in such a serious matter, it has to be established by the church, the authorities in the church, I would say. I mean, it can't just be left to our private opinion, or else there would be chaos.
You'd end up like Shelley in the 15th century.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so ultimately, to wrap up this final segment of our show, I want to share these two quotes that, we're often derided by sedevacantists as whether it's trad ink, but Mario Dirksen from Novus Ordo Watch likes to call us semi-trads, and all that, recognizing resistors or whatever. Well, here's where that phrase comes from. I have two quotes here on the screen. One I love from the Summa, which says, St. Thomas says, if the faith were endangered, a subject ought to rebuke his prelate even publicly, which is what we've done today, respectfully. And the example he gives is the rebuke of Peter by Paul. Hence, Paul, who was Peter's subject, rebuked him in public on account of the imminent danger of scandal concerning faith. And as the gloss of Augustine says on Galatians chapter 2, verse 11, Peter gave an example to superiors that if at any time they should happen to stray from the straight path, they should not disdain to be reproved by their subjects. And then we have St. Robert Bellarmine, also from De Romane Pontifice, book 2, chapter 29. Just as it would be lawful to resist a pontiff invading a body, so it is lawful to resist him invading souls or disturbing a state, and much more if he should endeavor to destroy the church. Well, how would you destroy the church? You would destroy it through heresy, among other things, but the spiritual destruction of the church. We're not talking about trying to demolish physical buildings. We're talking about the mystical body of Christ here. So Bellarmine says, I say it is lawful to resist him by not doing what he commands and by blocking him, lest he should carry out his will. Still, it is not lawful to judge or punish or even depose him, because he is nothing other than a superior. So that's kind of where I stand. That's where I take my my guidance and my marching orders. I'm trying to do what these great saints and doctors of the church have told us to do.
Only with that one, let's see. It's trickier what Bellarmine's actually quoting, because because in chapter 29, he's on a different subject, which is answering the arguments of various Protestants against the Pope's authority. And and so the argument was it'd be lawful for anyone to slay a pontiff if he was invaded by someone. I'm trying to remember how that all goes. Invaded by someone unjustly, and therefore it'd be much more lawful for kings or a council to depose a pope if he would disturb the state and the peace of souls. He's talking politically in that subject, and you got to remember Christendom at that time. The Pope is an independent monarch, and if he'd used the authority of the church even to unjustly deprive a head of state, and that was of course a big thing with Protestants and such. And so the tyranny of the papacy, they try to and of course Bellarmine argues that the Pope has only an indirect power over the earth, and the Protestants treated it like it was a direct power, and that he could just depose any monarch he liked and rearrange all the laws of a country and whatever. Whereas Bellarmine's arguing with the classical synthesis of scholastics and the fathers, that you have church and state. And whenever those Venn diagrams have a crossover, the church has the authority in that Venn diagram crossover, which is, for Bellarmine, citing St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure, things for the salvation of souls is in that Venn diagram crossover. So so he argues that again the Pope can depose a monarch even by divine law, but only for the sake of the faith, not just because he doesn't like him or they disagree on this or that or what have you. So in Melchior Arcana says the same thing, and it's largely in because he's advising Charles V, because Charles V is really mad that the Pope is seeming to not go along with what he wants. And Melchior Arcana is advising him that no, you can actually do this. You can withdraw, resist him, withdraw your diplomatic support, and he's speaking more politically. And of course, if he'd seek to destroy the church, and that's like an extreme end of it. And it's I think you could probably make the argument through heresy, but it's like the Pope as head of state, or even if he tries to give ecclesiastical laws that are detrimental to souls, do you have to obey someone who's telling you something that's obviously against divine law? No.
Right.
Any superior whatsoever. So even in a religious order, right? If they're telling you to commit some sin, then you can resist them lawfully. Right? They can't use obedience to make you do that. So that's the resistance they're talking about. Now we could extend it. I'd have to look into his sources too, because if I'm not mistaken, he cites Cajetan and Torquemada.
Yes.
But yeah, it's been a while since I've been through there. That book was years ago. I should say too, that book, there's still a lot of typos in it. That was I said this on a Catholic Family News interview with Murray Rundis. When I put out on the Roman Pontiff, I was in a situation where one, I had to manage kids, we're going through a complicated financial thing, and I needed money. So I rushed that thing out, and then it was full of copy errors, and that's not playing to my strength, right? Trying to edit things like that. That's why I have other people do it now. And there was a mess of a whole bunch of things. And then someone went through it for me, graciously fixed a lot of things. I might have missed a few things because it was all marked up in the pages, and we fixed that, went through that, and then I produced a much stronger version, which you've got now. There's still, some errors in it. One thing the Sedevacantists, I've seen them attack before in different places, is let me see if I can open the PDF here and get to it. But where the way I translated the word mulk. So here we go. This is the, I just opened up the Latin here as I'm looking at it. This is the opinion of all the ancient fathers who teach that manifest heretics, mulx omittere omnem jurisdictionem, that soon lose all jurisdiction. So they claim that I purposely, intentionally mistranslated that to make Bellarmine look like a conciliarist. It's completely false. So firstly, the word mulx, when you look it up in any dictionary, it says soon. And soon has two senses in English. As soon as it's done, like right now. Right. And soon, like, honey, your wife says, honey, will you fix this or take out the garbage? Soon. Because you're sitting there, you don't want to put it down. Soon might mean tomorrow or next week, right?
Right.
And when I translated that, I understood soon as like right away. And when you look up soon in the Oxford English Dictionary, you find, although it is under the antiquated usage, right away, immediately. So that, so I went with the translate, it seems to have the sense of, right now. And I figured the safest way is to go like with every dictionary says soon, because soon does have that meaning to it right now. The sense is obviously right now. And that's why I rendered it that way. And then they'll say, oh, you mistranslated ipso facto. The word ipso facto doesn't even appear in this paragraph. Hello. Maybe check the Latin before you start attacking me for it. But, but it does say, but that word mulx does have the sense of right now. And I did not mean to translate that to suggest later. I meant to now. Because I felt it was the safest way to keep the propriety of the word, as well as, and because it has that antiquated sense in it. And there's lots of things I use in its antiquated sense just because I'm trying to make sure I'm exact as much as I can be. And that usually the thing I get accused of is not purposely monkeying with things, but I'm too literal. That's usually, so the first attack is I'm too literal until there's something else they don't want. And then it's this. Right. So, I mean, there are errors in my works here and there because I'm one guy and I got kids on me and I get disrupted and distracted and have to stop, find out why people are fighting and yelling, go back, where was I? And then, look and then I say, oh, wait, no, I'm on the wrong one because it's like attached to the word being on, but it's in like 3 lines down. So I got to go back. Yeah. And I missed a line here and there. Every translator has that thing. You want to attack me and say that it's not faithful. You can't read it because I missed a line here and there. It's like thousands of pages at this point of translation. You come up with 7 or 8, 9 errors. That's low, the realm of translation errors. Sorry to tell you. Yeah. So it's, it just is what it is. But that, but the teaching there, haec est sententia omnium veterum patrum, quid docent hereticos manifestos mox omittere omnem jurisdictionem. I've rendered that pretty much what it is. And if you want to bring your interpretation in and say, I'm trying to say this, well, fine. But mulx, you open it up. What's the first meaning? Soon. What is sense of soon? Generally, right now, there's a reason Bellarmine chose that word. And I was not going to, even though the sense is right away, it's now. Just in case I wasn't going to, use a different word and bring what I thought into it when the word's not there. For a reason. And he meant essentially as soon as it happened, as soon as he's done it, he's lost all jurisdiction. And that's obviously the sense of it. But again, I didn't want to misrender Bellarmine because look, if I was going to monkey around with Bellarmine, I would be, all his stuff on, obedience to government officials in his catechism or, the monarchy being the best system of government. I'm a bit of an anarchist. And so that's what I would monkey around with if I had a mind to monkey around with something that somebody says. So just to bring it out there, just to address that point, because it's been said. And of course, the big ones going after me for my translation are beneficantists, because, well, here I have that 1 Peter 5 article, they still that makes the clear distinction of munus and ministerium, and then the clear fact that these words are synonymous, and they're not, that you can use one for the other, and not just me, but oodles of people far more proficient in Latin than I am. Said the same thing. Jonathan Errington, for example, he's done some work for me. His Latin's better than mine. In fact, the only reason that the news of Benedict's resignation got out as fast as it did is because all the cardinals sitting there, actually, because he gave the whole address in Latin, very few of them knew what he said. But Errington was there, and he heard every word, and he understood immediately Benedict had renounced the papacy. And he got that to Vatican Information Service, and they ran the story, and that's why it broke so fast, because none of the cardinals who were there knew what he was saying, because their Latin proficiency is down. And almost everyone who read it right away, they understood that. It wasn't until Francis became Pope that all of a sudden, let's look for something. And now they're doubling and tripling down that Francis F. Benedict clearly has a letter where he said, no, this is stupid. I renounced it all, right? Because they have to. They've worked themselves into that corner. And they're going to come up with more crazy, ridiculous arguments. So, I mean, you can pillar my translation as much as you like. It's still there, and I'm going to do more. And speaking of more, I'm almost done getting I just have a few more sections to get back from editing. The final section on the church, there's a section in the middle I haven't done yet that I'm going to go back to. But on the defense, well, I already published this book on defending canonizations a few years ago. And the rest of that book is going to come out. I'm going to get rid of the standalone one on canonizations. I'm just going to work it all in the Opera Omnia volume so that canonization, the defense of images and relics, the defense and their veneration, the defense on the sign of the cross, the building of churches, liturgy, etc., that we can have these things and it's not against the word of God the way Protestants claim. So that volume is coming out, and then hopefully his full treatise on the Eucharist before the end of the year. That's going to be a little bit more work, but I've got so many things like bits and bobs that I've worked on over the years, and only the last year or so since I got remarried, I've been able to try to get all this stuff back together, get back on the moving on this stuff. So
Right.
Anyway,
awesome. Well, that's I think a good place to end. We've been going for about 3 hours and 15 minutes now, so quite a marathon. Thank you to everybody.
Earlier you asked what we're going to do, and I said, even though it's early in the morning, all this talk makes me want to get a bourbon.
Yeah, exactly. So let me put up, as we close up here, I'm going to put up Ryan's website on the screen so people can see what that looks like, Mediatrix Press. And it looks like, let's see, so share, there we go. And he's got some various deals, looks like, circulating on the homepage. 25% off paperback, 15% off the hardcover for St. John Fisher's Against Luther's Babylonian Captivity. Also, the history of St. Norbert, the life of St. Alphonsus Liguori.
That's actually a 3-volume, by the way.
Ooh,
That's
this
the
looks good.
You haven't seen that? I've had that up for a little bit.
Nice. I have not looked into that yet. It looked with a new forward by our friend Father Chad Ripperger. That looks great. So lots of good stuff over at Mediatrix Press. I'm going to put a link in the live chat so people can go visit your website. All right, there we go. All right, well, we still have over 300 people joining us, about 323 on what it says on my end.
So, you guys listen to me.
Yes.
Somebody says, "Oh, I love listening to you in the rundown." I'm like, "Really? You didn't run the other direction?"
Speaking of that, here's what somebody said recently. Said, "Excellent discussion, gentlemen. Pity there was no screaming cowboy and vibing cat intro." And as people may have noticed, I have recently joined the rundown at their invitation, so I'm glad to be a part of that team and look forward to doing future shows with them. And so yeah, I'm sure we both have things we need to get done the rest of the day, so we better end it here and say thank you so much to everybody who's joined us. Please do give us a like, thumbs up if you've enjoyed the discussion, and subscribe to my channel, Veritatis Vox. Also, the Rundown has a channel as well. I think if they've searched, what is it, Catholic Disinfo Hour or something like that, or is it just called the Rundown? I forget.
I can find out for you. Let's see. Let's see here.
See if I can. Yeah, I can put a link to that in the live chat as well. I know I'm subscribed.
The Rundown 4304. I need to do something about that, but that's the handle.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, I'll just put a link in the.
If you do Catholic Rundown, you should find it. Because there's a lot, we didn't realize it when we made it. There's a lot of different things that are Rundown. There's even a movie called The Rundown, right? So if you just type in the Catholic Rundown, you'll find it in our past live streams and such.
Yeah, and I put a link in the live chat just now, so you have that direct link there as well. So, well, thank you everybody so much, and we'll look forward to I'm hopefully going to be doing another interview next Monday on the Feast of St. Michael the Archangel. We'll see if that ends up working out. You know, I'm trying to do this on top of working on average about 50 hours a week at a day job, so it's challenging, but doing what we can. And so look forward to seeing you all again soon, and seeing Ryan again soon, either here or on the rundown. So God bless you all, and Our Lady keep you. Take care.